Owen Smith is here as a Labour MP. The big breaking news is that there is speculation over why Theresa May, the Prime Minister, is about to give a statement just after 11 o'clock on the steps of Downing Street. Could it be a snap general election? Have you heard anything, Owen Smith, as a Labour MP?
No, I've heard nothing about it. I came to discuss something far more important, which is the plight of the women in this audience. I've no idea what Theresa May is going to do.
As a Labour politician, would you welcome a snap general election?
Always look forward to general elections. They're a lot of fun.
OK, thank you very much. We'll be live in Downing Street in just a moment, but first our political correspondent Vicki Young. Hi Vicki, what is the latest?
Well, I have to say, we are in the realms of complete speculation. And as you know, Victoria, this place, Westminster, likes nothing more than a bit of speculation. But of course, I think number one on that list has got to be the possibility of a snap general election, even though Theresa May has said constantly that she wouldn't have an early general election. You can see why she may well be tempted looking at the polls. Labour in all sorts of trouble. And she, of course, has a very small majority, which is causing her problems. And the temptation must be absolutely huge for her. Now, there are other possibilities. There is speculation it could be an announcement about direct rule for Northern Ireland, for example. Could it be a resignation on health grounds is another possibility, or a foreign policy announcement. All of those are possible. The reason this is so unusual is because Prime Ministers don't often come out into Downing Street and get behind that lectern. That is reserved for very big, significant announcements. And the other thing which is unusual here is that there has been no pre-briefing, if you like. Quite often Downing Street will say, the Prime Minister's coming out, she's going to make an announcement, it's going to be about foreign policy. Well, we've had nothing like that. And of course Downing Street will know that everyone will be speculating about the possibility of a general election. Now, of course, we do have something called the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which means that the next election is set for 2020 and not before. But there are ways around that. Theresa May could try and ask Parliament to vote for it. 2/3 of MPs would have to do that. That would be 434 MPs would have to vote for it. Labour sources close to Jeremy Corbyn have said for the last few weeks that they would vote for a general election. The other option for Theresa May is to try and get a no confidence vote in her own government. Now that of course would be pretty unusual. She won't relish doing it that way, but that is the other possibility. She could also just overturn the legislation which has fixed term parliament set in it, but that could be pretty lengthy. It might run into trouble in the House of Lords. So there are ways that she can do it. The issue really has always been whether she wants to do it or not. And I think up till now, she, as you know, is a very cautious politician. People have wondered why she wouldn't be tempted by this. So polls suggesting the Tory party would be 20 points ahead of Labour must make it feel to her like a good option. The earliest date it could be, if she were to say today that she wants to do this, would be the 25th of May. There had been quite a lot of speculation that it could be on the same day as local elections at the beginning of May. It's too late for that to happen now. I think what she and her advisors will have been mulling over in the last few weeks is that, of course, yes, they're ahead. They might lose out to the Liberal Democrats in some areas, but they would hope to gain an awful lot from Labour. They feel that Jeremy Corbyn is leading the Labour Party in a way that would help the Tories, and she must be tempted when she looks at those polls and they suggest that she could get a landslide victory in a general election. I mean, the downside for her is that she has said very clearly, and only a few weeks ago her official spokesman said that it wasn't going to happen, this idea of an early election. She would have to go back on that, but I think within just a few hours of this happening, people would have forgotten about that. The only question is really whether voters have fatigue if they have obviously voted recently, only 2 years ago, the general election which David Cameron won, and of course the referendum. And Brexit is also relevant here. It's going to be a very tough couple of years for Theresa May, and I think to have a much bigger majority in the House of Commons would really help her. I think she's run into trouble over other legislation and other policies recently. It is, of course, much, much easier to govern if you have a larger number of MPs on your side. And she may also wish to get her own mandate because, of course, it was David Cameron that won the last general election.
Thank you very much, Vicki. Norman Smith is at Downing Street. He's put his winter coat on. He means business. OK, what will voters think if Theresa May is calling a snap general election in order to boost her Conservative majority in the House of Commons?
Well, it's a gamble. There's no getting away from that. But she may take the view that she's more powerful now than she's ever going to be. She may look back at what happened to Gordon Brown, who you remember kind of oohed and ahed about going for it and in the end bottled it. And look what happened to him. He had those slow years of drudgery down to election defeat. And she might just take the view, it's never going to get any better. Now is the time. And, you know, she surprised us. She has been a bold Prime Minister. We all thought of her as sort of cautious Theresa who never really does anything out of the ordinary. Blow me down, she becomes Prime Minister, gets rid of all the Cameroons, ploughs ahead full steam with Brexit. I mean, she's continually surprised us. So it's not at all impossible that she would go for the snap general election. Now, you know, little bits and pieces in the wind. If you look at the lectern behind me, one person has messaged me to say, aha, it doesn't have the government logo on it. So it's going to be a Conservative Party announcement. Does that mean it's going to be a general election? No idea. Frankly, Vic, I feel a bit like Manuel in Fawlty Towers. Remember the Fawlty Towers episode where he's going around saying, I know nothing, I know nothing. Well, really, I know nothing. However, let's try someone who might know something. Patrick Kidd, parliamentary sketch writer from The Times. What's your take?
Well, I know nothing either, but I can confirm it's not Larry the cat. Word was going around that something might be wrong, that Larry might be ill. We've seen him.
That would be unforgivable if anything had happened to Larry.
That would be one of the things that would get people down here. But we've had an hour now, haven't we, since the news came out? An early election would have made sense 3 weeks ago. But with the local elections, the mayoral elections, and of course the by-election in Manchester in only 3 weeks' time, it doesn't make much sense now because she can't just call a snap election. It has to go through Parliament with either a vote of no confidence or other mechanisms. So actually, the ball won't start rolling for another week at least. Who knows? People speculate, is the Prime Minister unwell? She didn't look it at the weekend, and of course no one wishes her unwell. Some were saying, is it Northern Ireland or something like that? But why would that not be made to Parliament as a statement? Parliament resumes after the Easter holiday at 2:30. So we just don't know, unless it's something to do with foreign policy, perhaps. Obviously, there's been all sorts of goings on with Korea and America. Maybe there's going to be some change of position there from us that can't wait until this afternoon's Commons business. We just don't know. Maybe she's going to make a view about the Lions rugby squad, which is being announced soon as well.
But it's fair to say, isn't it, Patrick? I think amongst most of the journalists here, there is a kind of sense that all those other options outside of an election, they all look a little bit unlikely. I mean, the kind of mood is an election does seem to be the front-running option at the moment.
Well, as you just said, she has no better time. She's just had 2 opinion polls showing her with a 21-point lead. It's never, well, maybe it's not going to get better than that, but she's had 18, 17-point leads for the last few weeks. It doesn't make sense to do it now. But, you know, in the absence of anything else, all we can talk about is an early election.
What do you read, if anything, into the fact we have Cabinet this morning, began at 8:30. They're all still in there. Now, I mean, I know from standing outside cabinets for far too long, they usually pack in within an hour and a half. There's a dribble of people out. No one has left the room.
No, so you haven't had the shots of them all disappearing and a chance to shout at them. The email came from Downing Street earlier saying there will be the normal lobby briefing post-Cabinet at midday, which suggested this was just a normal day in the life. All I can say is that anticipation is growing. The crowd is building here on Downing Street. Tourists are gathering at the end of behind us. We'll find out at 11:15.
It is extraordinary, though, isn't it, that, you know, the times we live in politically are extraordinary. We think of, you know, Brexit, we think of Trump, we think of Theresa May, Boris, and now this. But we've sort of become used to these momentous moments.
Yes, nothing is predictable anymore. And for me, writing political satire, it's very hard to satirise what's going on when it's so incredible what is actually happening. We've still got 3 hours after this announcement before the Commons sits. And, of course, if it is an early election, anticipation will build of excitement down there.
I'm going to stop you there, Patrick. Vic, I think you're still outside Westminster on College Green, yes?
No, it's me in the studio. I just want to ask if there is a snap general...
Sorry,
It's all right. Don't worry. There's too many Victorias, I know. If it is about a quick general election, what would it mean for opposition parties, in particular Labour?
Whoa, I mean... You have to say it doesn't look great, does it? I mean, we had a couple of polls over the weekend suggesting what they were 21 points behind. I mean, you really are going back to the darkest days of Michael Foot to come up with anything like that. I mean, they talk a good game. They have been rolling out policies, but I don't think anyone's under any illusions. They face an almighty titanic task. Just go back to what before recess we had that Copeland by-election where, you know, Mrs May won a seat she should never have won from Labour, never ever have won, and she may have, you know, that may have kind of led her to the view, this is the moment, I can't do any better, I'm winning Labour seats when I'm in government, go for it. And, you know, there have been plenty of people in Tory ranks saying, yeah, come on, get on with it. William Hague, for example, who, you know, he sort of takes the role as sort of as an outsider, who, of course, is still incredibly plugged in. Just the other day, he wrote a long article, I think in the Telegraph, saying, you know, really, you ought to look seriously at an early election because the advantages are so significant.
But
if she does go for it... Sorry, Vic.
Remember, she was pretty emphatic, wasn't she, about not having a quick general election, not going for it, because she said it was not in the national interest. I mean, you know, going back on her word, that's not good for any politician.
There are real problems here. This is, you know, a woman who sort of built her reputation on being steady, dependable, reliable, to just chuck out to the window her previous, you know, promises not to cut and run but to go the full distance. Yep, you could say that would do her damage. But then again, you think this is the woman who actually campaigned for Remain and now has become Mrs. Brexit. So, you know, she's managed to get around that. And what history kind of tells us is that winner takes all. And if she holds a general election and she wins a stonking great majority, don't expect many of her colleagues to be going around saying, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, you really shouldn't have broken your promise. They won't care. And I suppose it would provide clarity, it would provide certainty, it would provide her with that sort of mandate, and it would be the Brexit election. And she might argue it enables me to go into these negotiations, to go eyeball to eyeball with Mr. Barnier and all the others and say, I've got the country behind me, I've just won a stonking mandate, don't mess with me. It hugely strengthens her hand. So, you know, maybe she's going to go for it.
But we don't know. Let's make that clear to people who are tuning in right now. We don't know what she's going to say in just over 5 minutes' time. Some speculation, she could be resigning. If that were to be the case, what might she be resigning over? I mean, again, I can't believe I'm asking these questions, but we're in the realms of speculation, and there are those three options: resignation, general election, or military deployment.
Yeah, I personally think the health one is unlikely, only because she looks fit as a fiddle at the moment, let's be honest. She's been sort of round and about. She's been, in America? She's been in Saudi Arabia, Turkey. I mean, she's continually on her travels. I'm always slightly amazed physically. She's up for it because, you know, we all know she has type 1 diabetes. She has to have 2 insulin jabs every day. There must be a fair amount of wear and tear with the stress of the job, but actually, looking at her, I would say she probably thrives on it, actually. She certainly seems to have, you know, grown in self-confidence since the Prime Minister. She does not look like an ill person to me. But, you know, you don't know people's private health situation, so you can't rule it out. All I can say is from what I've seen of her, she looks okay. What would happen? There would be a caretaker Prime Minister, and then I imagine there would have to be a leadership contest in the Tory party, another one, and would have to go through, gosh, I don't know, does that bring Boris Johnson back into the frame? I have no idea. I mean, we're in sort of the outer Himalayas of speculation land here. We really are.
Okay.
I hesitate to go there, but technically it would mean a leadership contest.
Right.
And then you'd have to ask what kind of mandate would that person have? Because, you know, Theresa May didn't do an election. Could you really have another Tory leader who hadn't had an election? I mean, you're getting so far away from David Cameron's election victory.
Okay. And what about the military deployment speculation?
I think that's very, very doubtful. If you try to look at flashpoints, conflicts where we might deploy, I mean, Syria, the government's been very clear. We're not putting boots on the ground. Parliament voted against even airstrikes in Syria following the recent cruise missile attack on President Assad. Michael Fallon and everyone went out of the way to say we're looking for a political solution. So I don't get the sense there's any appetite whatsoever for us to be involved in a military solution. North Korea, I mean, let's be honest, it's on the other side of the world. It's not really our bag. It's not the sort of thing we would get involved with, I doubt. Some sort of renewed operation against IS in Iraq, I don't know, that would need a statement here. Surely it would be a House of Commons statement.
Fair enough.
So,
Norman,
the two front runners are health and election.
Our colleague Laura Koonsberg is saying one source, unconfirmed, speculation that a general election is going to be called for June the 8th.
Okay, well, you know, that is quite conceivable. June the 8th. Am I right in thinking that's the day of the referendum last year?
No, that was June the 24th, 23rd.
Okay, sorry. I just wondered whether there was some sort of symbolic. No, that's quite possible.
Okay,
she can't do it in time for the May elections because they're too soon. They're only a fortnight away. So yes, she could go for an early summer snap election.
And Reuters are also saying that as well.
Okay, well, that does seem to be suggesting then that that's where we're going. I mean,
Okay.
We're going to find out pretty soon because she'll be coming out. So we will hear it from Mrs. May herself.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Norman. Thank you. And Mrs. May herself live on BBC News at 11:15. So do stay tuned. Thanks for your company today. Back tomorrow at 9.
Hello, good morning. The early morning frost is all melting away. We've got largely clear skies for most of the UK thanks to this area of high pressure, but a weak front coming into western Scotland will bring some thicker cloud and eventually some damp weather getting into the Western Isles, the Highlands towards the end of the day, probably brightening up in Northern Ireland for a time, but the best of the sunshine will be across East Scotland and for England and Wales too. Temperatures inland reaching double figures for many areas, so feeling quite pleasant in London, but a little bit cooler around some of our coastal areas with onshore winds. Now overnight tonight, a really cold night on the cards, not so much for Northern Ireland and Scotland, although there could be a few pockets of frost. It's across England and Wales where temperatures will plummet down to -4, -5 degrees in the coldest spots. This is potentially a damaging frost for those tender plants, so gardeners take note. Apart from the cold start though, should be a decent start to the day with some sunshine, turning cloudier through the day for Northern England and Wales, and a fair bit of cloud again for Northern Ireland and Western Scotland where there'll be a few passing showers. Temperatures between 12 and 14 degrees. That's your weather.
We are live in Downing Street, where the Prime Minister is due to make a significant announcement in the next 15 minutes. Theresa May's statement is unscheduled. Number 10 have not said what she will say. I'm Joanna Gosling, live in the studio. We will bring you the statement as soon as it happens.
One unconfirmed source tells the BBC Theresa May is poised to announce a snap general election on June the 8th.
Good afternoon. Welcome to BBC News. And welcome to viewers on BBC One and the BBC News channel. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, is to make a surprise announcement in the next 15 minutes, the details of which are closely guarded, but statements by the Prime Minister in Downing Street are usually reserved for significant announcements. Let's go straight to our Assistant Political Editor, Norman Smith, in Downing Street for us. And Norman, the speculation is around an early election. What are you hearing?
Joanna, we have one unconfirmed source telling the BBC that Theresa May looks set to announce a snap general election on June the 8th. So that is what, roughly about 6 weeks away, ignoring previous promises by Number 10 that she would not go for an early summer election. She would stay the whole course through to 2020, repeatedly dismissing the idea. But we are now in a situation where some opinion polls are giving the Conservatives a lead of more than 20% over the Labour Party. And there is a view that Mrs. May could have decided that it is never going to be a better moment than now to go for a general election. It would also give her a huge mandate if she was to win the sort of majority that many in her party believe she could win. It would give her the sort of mandate to go into the Brexit negotiations with a hugely strengthened hand. She would in effect have held a Brexit election and would be able to go to Brussels saying, I have secured a mandate to secure this sort of deal on behalf of the British people. So it would hugely strengthen her hand in that. More than that, it would enable her to pursue her own domestic agenda, to pursue the sorts of policies on grammar schools, speculation about whether she might want to end the commitment to overseas aid staying at 0.7%, and other initiatives where she may want to jettison the Cameron legacy. If she had a snap general election, she could pursue that agenda. And lastly, it would free her from the danger of constant revolts and defeats with that narrow majority of around 16. We saw the effect of that in the House of the Commons when the Chancellor was forced to backtrack in the face of a looming Tory revolt over national insurance changes. If Mrs May was to get the sort of majority, as I say, some think she could get, then that would free her from the permanent danger of Tory revolt. So there are huge potential political advantages from going for a snap election. The disadvantages are that it would be seen as breaking a repeated promise by Downing Street not to go for that snap early election. There is also a risk factor. You simply do not know what happens in general elections. There is the uncertainty. There are many Tory MPs in Remain-facing constituencies who might be worried about going to the polls against Liberal Democrat candidates campaigning strongly for a second referendum. They might be vulnerable. We saw that with Zach Goldsmith in Richmond. They might be much more reluctant to have an early general election. She would also wave goodbye to the boundary review changes, which would give her an additional 20 or so seats. So there are reasons not to go. But you sense, with that poll lead, in the wake of the Copeland by-election victory, when she overturned a seat she should never, ever have won, she may take the view it is never going to get better than now.
What are the logistics around calling an early election? Because there is the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which would mean that the next election is not scheduled until 2020. How to get around that?
The way you get around that is either you have to engineer a vote of no confidence in the government, or 2/3 of MPs have to vote for a general election. And that, I surmise, is the route she will go down, because Labour has said, I think on the record, they would be happy to vote for a general election. They're not for it, they're up for it. Theresa May well choose to call their bluff and say, and Theresa May is coming out now, let's hear what she's got to say.
I have just chaired a meeting of the Cabinet where we agreed that the government should call a general election to be held on the 8th of June. I want to explain the reasons for that decision, what will happen next, and the choice facing the British people when you come to vote in this election. Last summer, after the country voted to leave the European Union, Britain needed certainty, stability, and strong leadership. And since I became Prime Minister, the government has delivered precisely that. Despite predictions of immediate financial and economic danger, since the referendum, we have seen consumer confidence remain high, record numbers of jobs, and economic growth that has exceeded all expectations. We have also delivered on the mandate that we were handed by the referendum result. Britain is leaving the European Union, and there can be no turning back. And as we look to the future, the government has the right plan for negotiating our new relationship with Europe. We want a deep and special partnership between a strong and successful European Union and a United Kingdom that is free to chart its own way in the world. That means we will regain control of our own money, our own laws, and our own borders. And we will be free to strike trade deals with old friends and new partners all around the world. This is the right approach, and it is in the national interest. But the other political parties oppose it. At this moment of enormous national significance, there should be unity here in Westminster, but instead there is division. The country is coming together, but Westminster is not. In recent weeks, Labour have threatened to vote against the final agreement we reach with the European Union. The Liberal Democrats have said they want to grind the business of government to a standstill. The Scottish National Party say they will vote against the legislation that formally repeals Britain's membership of the European Union. And unelected members of the House of Lords have vowed to fight us every step of the way. Our opponents believe, because the government's majority is so small, that our resolve will weaken and that they can force us to change course. They are wrong. They underestimate our determination to get the job done. And I am not prepared to let them endanger the security of millions of working people across the country. Because what they are doing jeopardises the work we must do to prepare for Brexit at home. And it weakens the government's negotiating position in Europe. If we do not hold a general election now, their political game playing will continue, and the negotiations with the European Union will reach their most difficult stage in the run-up to the next scheduled election. Division in Westminster will risk our ability to make a success of Brexit, and it will cause damaging uncertainty and instability to the country. So we need a general election, and we need one now, because we have at this moment a one-off chance to get this done while the European Union agrees its negotiating position and before the detailed talks begin. I have only recently and reluctantly come to this conclusion. Since I became Prime Minister, I have said that there should be no election until 2020. But now I have concluded that the only way to guarantee certainty and stability for the years ahead is to hold this election and seek your support for the decisions I must take. And so tomorrow, I will move a motion in the House of Commons calling for a general election to be held on the 8th of June. That motion, as set out by the Fixed Term Parliament Act, will require a two-thirds majority of the House of Commons. So I have a simple challenge to the opposition parties. You have criticised the government's vision for Brexit. You have challenged our objectives. You have threatened to block the legislation we put before Parliament. This is your moment to show you mean it, to show you are not opposing the government for the sake of it, to show that you do not treat politics as a game. Let us tomorrow vote for an election. Let us put forward our plans for Brexit and our alternative programmes for government, and then let the people decide. And the decision facing the country will be all about leadership. It will be a choice between strong and stable leadership in the national interest, with me as your Prime Minister, or weak and unstable coalition government led by Jeremy Corbyn, propped up by the Liberal Democrats who want to reopen the divisions of the referendum, and Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP. Every vote for the Conservatives will make it harder for opposition politicians who want to stop me from getting the job done. Every vote for the Conservatives will make me stronger when I negotiate for Britain with the Prime Ministers, Presidents and Chancellors of the European Union. Every vote for the Conservatives will mean we can stick to our plan for a stronger Britain and take the right long-term decisions for a more secure future. It was with reluctance that I decided the country needs this election, but it is with strong conviction that I say it is necessary to secure the strong and stable leadership the country needs to see us through Brexit and beyond. So tomorrow, let the House of Commons vote for an election. Let everybody put forward their proposals for Brexit and their programmes for government. And let us remove the risk of uncertainty and instability and continue to give the country the strong and stable leadership it demands.
Dramatic announcement in Downing Street by the Prime Minister calling a general election for the 8th of June. Previously, she had said she would not call a snap election, and referencing what she said about the prospects of a snap election in the past, she said it is only recently and reluctantly that she has come to the conclusion that an early election is needed, she says, as the only way to guarantee certainty and stability for the years ahead. She said her government is determined to see Brexit through, and she said opposition MPs, in the way that they have been talking about voting against the government, is damaging that and also hampering the government's negotiating position in Europe. And she says that is why she will start the process tomorrow in the Commons to override the Fixed Term Parliament Act that would have meant the next election being in 2020 in order to allow an election to go ahead on June the 8th. Well, let's go back to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith in Downing Street. So there it is, Norman, another election, the second in 2 years.
6-week election campaign. Who would have guessed that? Who would have thought we were going to go into a snap general election? Theresa May's argument is basically Brexit, that she cannot secure the best Brexit deal for the British people because of what she says is the uncertainty, the divisions at Westminster, pinpointing the blame, as it were, on Labour for saying they may vote against the final deal, the SNP for saying they may vote against the Great Repeal Bill, the Lib Dems for pressing for a second referendum, in effect saying they jeopardise Brexit. And I think she said they also threaten the livelihoods of millions of people because the outcome she may be able to secure will be weakened by the fact she will have a weaker negotiating hand. If she wins a general election, then Mrs May says she will have the mandate to secure the sort of deal that she wants. So in a way, it seemed to me she was almost trying to pitch herself as on the side of the people against Westminster, against those Westminster parties playing games, she said. So she is presenting this as the Brexit election, and she is the Brexit candidate, is in effect how Theresa May is presenting this moment. She said she'd come to this decision reluctantly, and that was the only nod we really had from Mrs May to the fact that she's done a U-turn. She's scrapped her previous promises that she's going to serve the whole term. She's not going to go for a snap election. She said reluctantly she had decided she couldn't go on because of the division and uncertainty at Westminster. So we now face a really ferocious battle over the next 6 weeks. Difficult for the other parties to work out how do they pitch it. Do they take her on over Brexit? Do they campaign against Brexit? The Liberal Democrats almost certainly will, but a very difficult one for Labour. One other thing I thought interesting, Joanna, Theresa May again reviving the fear that David Cameron stoked up in the last general election, which is this idea of Labour being propped up by the Scottish nationalists. Theresa May again alluding to that idea, saying, do you really want that sort of outcome? Tomorrow, of course, Mrs May will go to Parliament and in effect throw down the gauntlet to Jeremy Corbyn, saying, OK, you said you're ready for a general election, vote for it. And the real challenge for him, I suppose, will be it's very hard to see how he cannot vote for a general election without being accused of running away, of denying the people a vote.
Does that then make it almost certain it will get through, or are there still questions about whether this can actually go ahead?
Well, I mean, you know, it seems to me almost inconceivable that Jeremy Corbyn could say, well, no, we're not going to vote it. We'd just like you to carry on anyway. I mean, what sort of message does that send to your own people when Jeremy Corbyn has been so forthright in attacking Theresa May if he was just to relinquish this opportunity to get rid of her? That seems to me a non-runner, quite apart from, if you like, the political dynamics. How would it look? Mr Johnson, are you glad there's an early election? Mr Johnson, are you looking forward to an early election? OK, well, that's obviously cabinet ministers who've been in there since 8:30 are now leaving. Let's see who else are there. Mr Hunt, you're looking forward to an election? I get a feeling it's going to be a futile task. None of them is going to want to try and trump Theresa May, so they'll probably be very obedient and walk straight down the street. No, to come back to your point, Joanna, I think it's inconceivable that Jeremy Corbyn won't vote for it because, you know, what would it look like? It would look like he was Fred, he was running away. He'd get absolutely crucified in the media.
Norman, we'll be back with you, but let's just check in on what the polling is indicating about what might happen with an early election now in prospect. We can speak to Professor John Curtis, who's Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. And the polls, John Curtis, have been indicating that if Theresa May were to call an early election, they would favour her.
Oh, there is no doubt that the Conservatives are in a strong position in the opinion polls. If you take the average of the polls done by all the companies recently, the Conservatives are standing at 42%, Labour at 27%, and that clearly would be enough to give Theresa May a quite substantial majority. I think, however, two words of caution are in order. The first is we do have to bear in mind that it is quite difficult these days for either party to actually win a landslide in the House of Commons, because not only is Northern Ireland now out of the UK-wide political picture, but so also is Scotland. And I would be surprised if the SNP don't hang on to most of the seats north of the border that they won 2 years ago. Secondly, although the Labour Party are in a dire position in the opinion polls, a lot of the seats that they have are safe ones. And the truth is, therefore, if actually the opinion polls were to narrow during the course of this campaign, and I think we should bear in mind in particular, Theresa May is very much now going for a vote Conservative for my vision of Brexit, and that perhaps is going to make some Conservative voters unhappy. If that lead were to narrow, then we could discover that she's back with a rather smaller majority than perhaps she is hoping for this morning.
Would this election effectively become another referendum on Brexit?
Well, certainly that's the way in which she seems to be trying to pitch it. In the sense, she's essentially saying the reason why we need to have this referendum is because we need a government that has a clear majority that's committed to the version of Brexit that I want, which of course is a vision that says we're not going to be in the single market, we're probably not going to be in the customs union, and we're going to end freedom of movement. Now, I think one of the reasons why I think she's hoping that's going to be a successful pitch is that the Labour Party, of course, is rather at sixes and sevens on its stance on Brexit. There are divisions inside the Conservative Party. You'll see how they survive a general election. But the truth is the opposition is probably even more divided on the subject, and she's probably therefore banking that for so long as this remains the central issue, the Labour Party will not be capable of fighting an effective alternative position. Do we effectively need to look at how different constituencies voted in the referendum on European membership in order to get a sort of better predictor of the outcome? Because you look at the by-election in Richmond that Zach Goldsmith lost, and it very much came down to the fact that constituents there were in favour of Remain. That's true, but there aren't too many of the constituencies with a historic Liberal Democrat vote and a clear Remain vote. But yes, that will be one of the considerations, and certainly what Theresa May has at the moment, what lies behind her 42%, is a coalition. Around 2/3 of that vote is a Leave vote, and probably people who are happy with their vision of Brexit. 1/3 of it is a Remain vote, and the question is how much of that is willing to say, well, look, yes, actually, I wasn't that keen on the European Union in the first place. I'm happy to stick with the Tories' plan, or not. I think the bet that Theresa May is making, that quite a lot of those Conservative Remain voters were relatively reluctant Remain voters, and therefore, as a result, will be willing to stick with her. But that certainly is the risk that she's taking. It'll be interesting to see how voters feel about going back to the polls so soon. And indeed, certainly one of the things that will be thrown at the Prime Minister is indeed the fact that she has said very strongly during the course of the last 9 months or so that she didn't think there should be a general election, she didn't want to hold one, etc., etc. And this, in a sense, could be regarded as Theresa May's first major U-turn of her premiership. But I guess we shouldn't exaggerate the extent to which voters end up being concerned about issues of process, and that perhaps in the end she will be able to get away with this. But certainly we can anticipate, particularly in that debate that's now going to take place in the House of Commons tomorrow, that will be thrown at her, and it will be thrown at her pretty rigorously, I suspect, by her opponents. Thank you for now, John Curtis. Do stay with us, because we'd like to be able to keep on talking to you as we continue to digest this breaking news that the Prime Minister is going to be calling an election on the 8th of June. In order to get to that point, she does need a
majority of 2/3 of MPs in the Commons in order for the Fixed Term Parliament Act to be overridden. That would have meant the next election being in 2020, and up until now Theresa May has been adamant that she had no intention of calling an election prior to that. However, just in the past 5 minutes in Downing Street, she said that recently and reluctantly she has come to the conclusion that the only way to guarantee certainty and stability for the years ahead and for her to see through Brexit is for her to call an election. We've had reaction from the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Tim Farron, on Twitter. He said, "This election is your chance to change the direction of our country. If you want to avoid a disastrous hard Brexit, if you want to keep Britain in the single market, if you want a Britain that is open, tolerant and united, this is your chance." Only the Liberal Democrats can prevent a Conservative majority. So that the first reaction from one of the main political parties. No reaction yet from Labour, but let's go to our political correspondent Vicki Young, who's in Westminster with a Liberal Democrat, to get more reaction there. Vicki, over to you.
Yeah, that's right. Westminster likes nothing more than a lot of speculation, but now we know Theresa May wants another general election on June the 8th. First of all, she, as you say, has to get a vote through Parliament. Let's find out now from Liberal Democrats and from a Conservative MP too about what they think. Alistair Carmichael from the Liberal Democrats, Ian Duncan Smith from the Tories. First of all, will you vote for a general election? Do you welcome that or not?
We're well up for the fight for the 8th of June, if that is when it is going to be. This is a tremendous opportunity for the Liberal Democrats. We are now the only party in British politics that is putting the positive case for Britain at the heart of Europe. This is the opportunity for people who are not happy with Theresa May's hard Brexit, taking us out the single market, taking us away from the customs union, to make their views known. And the way you can do that on the 8th of May is by lending your vote to the Liberal Democrats.
Now, Theresa May has made this sound like it will be a vote about Brexit. She says part of the reason why she's changed her mind about an early election is because parties like yours want to grind parliamentary business down. You want to reverse the will of the British people. She has no choice.
Well, I think if you are somebody who wants to see Britain remain in the single market, in the currency union, if you reject the idea of a hard Brexit, then you've heard it from Theresa May already that just 9 Liberal Democrat MPs are able to make life sufficiently difficult for her. Just think what we could do if we were back to the strength we had again before 2015.
How confident are you that you can make gains? You, of course, had a terrible general election, winning 8 seats then, 1 by-election since then. Yeah, well, I mean, we had a very difficult time in 2015. That is, I think, well known. I think now people see the difference that Liberal Democrats did make in the coalition government. I think they can see for themselves what majority government has been like with the Conservatives. And you know, it's not a pretty sight. It's not a good time to be poor or to be young or to be to be lacking opportunities in this country. You get no help from a majority Conservative government. But if, as Mrs May wants, this becomes an election about Brexit, then you know Theresa May has said she wants a hard Brexit. The Labour Party have said they will not stand in the way of that. The Conservatives, the SNP cannot take any more than 1 seat from the Conservatives. The only people who can make a difference if you want to see Britain remain engaged with the European Union are the Liberal Democrats. Ian Duncan Smith, former Tory Cabinet Minister, are you surprised by this decision? Theresa May said she did not want an early general election. Why do you think she's done it?
Well, I think everyone will be surprised because the hands of the Prime Minister are always to keep this quiet until she announces it. I think she's made the right choice. I think the public has got enough time to realise that with Theresa May they've got somebody very focused, very clear. She makes a decision, she has real strong leadership. But I think she's right also that at the moment we have a government that was elected before the referendum, and it means right now we have a problem because in the Lords there's been a lot of talk about delaying and blocking this and making it very difficult to get it through. She's right to clear the air, to have a mandate, to come back and say, right, the British people want us to get on with this so that we can negotiate properly in Europe, and I think that's the right thing to do from a position of strength.
But there is a risk here. I mean, only just over half of the British people who voted wanted to leave the EU. If she makes this about Brexit again, isn't there a risk?
It's not about Brexit, it's about electing a government with a strong mandate to both get on with Brexit but also to carry on with normal domestic business. And the key thing about all of this is the reason for this general election is that right now there is a disproportionate state in the House of Lords which has now got a chance to vote on this. For example, you have 100 members of the House of Lords who are Liberal peers, but only 9 members of the House of Commons. So I think resetting that balance and making it very clear that you have a mandate in the Commons for Theresa May and the government to get on and run this so that we actually have a proper, strong, stable government over the next 5 years, which is both able to do Brexit, but also strong enough to do good domestic legislation.
I'll come back to Alistair in a second, but before that, actually, the real reason is that Labour are polling 20 points behind the Tories. Jeremy Corbyn's leadership is in trouble. Theresa May's looked at that and realised she can make a lot of gains.
Yeah, I think that's a secondary issue. I think the reality is that she really feels strongly that she needs that mandate. Now, of course, the Labour Party has its own particular problems, and I suspect there'll be a number of Labour MPs who will want also to see this general election for internal reasons. But the reality is that for Theresa May, this is a bold, strong, serious decision made by somebody who has complete confidence in their leadership. And I think the public, as they've shown in the polls about her personally, really genuinely feels that she is the right kind of person to lead them.
Her polling ratings are high, aren't they?
Ian says that this is the reason. It's no such thing. What you've heard from him is the excuse. The House of Lords did not stand in the way of the government when it came to triggering the Article 50. She got what she wanted through that, albeit that even that limited provision had to be brought kicking and screaming from her as a result of a court case. So, you know, it is opportunistic. She is doing something now that she said categorically she was not going to do. But this is how she has operated since day one. She is trying to run this country not from our national interest, but from the narrow party advantage of the Conservatives. This is just the most recent example of it. It is utterly opportunistic, but I tell you, it is an opportunity for the Liberal Democrats, and we are not going to pass it up.
But for you, you may well make some gains, but if she is heading for a landslide, as the polls suggest, what difference can you make?
The only way that you will stop a Conservative landslide, and you have to be very careful about trying to predict the future in politics these days.
As the polls suggest.
But the only thing that will stand in the way of a Conservative landslide is Liberal Democrats taking back the seats that we lost to them in 2015. That is happening week in, week out in council by-elections up and down the country. You will see that happen again, I believe, come the general election day.
Ian Douglas-Smith, there will be some Conservatives in the southwest of England who probably aren't that chuffed at this announcement. They will fear that they may lose out to the Liberal Democrats. But presumably Theresa May, you think, will look at the weakness of Labour, and that is what's tempted her.
Well, I think most importantly, she herself personally wants a mandate to be the Prime Minister elected by the British people. I think it's quite reasonable for her to want that. The second thing is she believes that it's important, with the most important negotiations we've conducted probably in 40 or 50 years, to have a mandate to do that with strength. And the third area is she also needs, therefore, to have a government that can get all of the domestic legislation through as well. I think if you add all those things together, this becomes a very sensible decision. I think, my instinct is, that there won't be a single Conservative MP that actually says they're unhappy about this. Every one of them wants to get this done so that we can all come back here and say, hopefully we get elected, we can't take that for granted, but if we come back elected, we can then say, now we can get on with our business and we can stop the nonsense that is, well, you don't have a mandate, all these arguments have been going on, the Liberals have used this. You don't have a mandate, you weren't elected as Prime Minister. Well, let's call their bluff. And let's put this on the table and say, now here's the chance for all of you to say, let's go out and fight that election and come back, let the British people decide who they want to lead them and where they want the leaders to take them.
If this was about Theresa May having to have a mandate of her own, then the time to have the election would have been July last year, maybe in the autumn. No. But she said at that time categorically she wasn't going to do it.
The wrong time,
I think that what you see now is that the temptation of the poll lead has just become too much for her. She needs to be cautious here, though. It seems to me that there is a lot of complacency and just a measure of arrogance in this announcement today. They are taking the voters for granted already, and as I've said already, the way that you reject that complacency and that arrogance is by giving your vote to the Liberal Democrats.
I don't think that's the case. I don't think she's in any way taking them for granted, and quite the contrary. You don't take an electorate for granted by going back to them and asking them, can you decide who you want to govern and how strong you want that government to be? And that's exactly what she's asking for. Now, Alistair and the Liberal Democrats
careful what you wish for.
Well, you want it. You want the general election. And Theresa May has quite rightly said we need to clear the air and get a clear mandate, and I think we'd all agree about that. So I don't know which is the party that doesn't want the election. Maybe they're not in this interview, but we need that mandate.
Okay, Ian Duncan-Smith, Alistair Carmichael, thank you very much. Let's get those battle buses ready.
Thank you very much. And as Ian Duncan-Smith said there, we still haven't heard from Labour. As soon as there is any reaction from Jeremy Corbyn, we will, of course, bring it to you. We'd love to know what you think about it as well. You can get in touch with me via Twitter at BBC Joanna G if you want to let me know what you think. Carl Goddard has said it's brilliant. It's a really good call for everyone. How do you see it? We had an election 2 years ago, referendum last year, and now we're heading for another general election on the 8th of June. Well, let's just remind ourselves of the moment Theresa May made that dramatic announcement in Downing Street just a little while ago.
I have just chaired a meeting of the Cabinet where we agreed that the government should call a general election to be held on the 8th of June. I want to explain the reasons for that decision, what will happen next, and the choice facing the British people when you come to vote in this election. Last summer, after the country voted to leave the European Union, Britain needed certainty, stability, and strong leadership. And since I became Prime Minister, the government has delivered precisely that. Despite predictions of immediate financial and economic danger, since the referendum, we have seen consumer confidence remain high, record numbers of jobs, and economic growth that has exceeded all expectations. We have also delivered on the mandate that we were handed by the referendum result. Britain is leaving the European Union, and there can be no turning back. And as we look to the future, the government has the right plan for negotiating our new relationship with Europe. We want a deep and special partnership between a strong and successful European Union and a United Kingdom that is free to chart its own way in the world. That means we will regain control of our own money, our own laws and our own borders. And we will be free to strike trade deals with old friends and new partners all around the world. This is the right approach, and it is in the national interest. But the other political parties oppose it. At this moment of enormous national significance, there should be unity here in Westminster. But instead, there is division. The country is coming together, but Westminster is not. In recent weeks, Labour have threatened to vote against the final agreement we reach with the European Union. The Liberal Democrats have said they want to grind the business of government to a standstill. The Scottish National Party say they will vote against the legislation that formally repeals Britain's membership of the European Union. And unelected members of the House of Lords have vowed to fight us every step of the way. Our opponents believe, because the government's majority is so small, that our resolve will weaken and that they can force us to change course. They are wrong. They underestimate our determination to get the job done. And I am not prepared to let them endanger the security of millions of working people across the country. Because what they are doing jeopardises the work we must do to prepare for Brexit at home. And it weakens the government's negotiating position in Europe. If we do not hold a general election now, their political game playing will continue, and the negotiations with the European Union will reach their most difficult stage in the run-up to the next scheduled election. Division in Westminster will risk our ability to make a success of Brexit, and it will cause damaging uncertainty and instability to the country. So we need a general election, and we need one now, because we have at this moment a one-off chance to get this done while the European Union agrees its negotiating position and before the detailed talks begin.
Theresa May with her announcement that she is going to be calling a general election for the 8th of June. That announcement completely unexpected and just in the last half hour. Let's go straight to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith in Downing Street. And unexpected, Norman, because she's been questioned repeatedly about whether she might call a general election, and she said no before.
She's been very clear about it. Downing Street has been very clear about it. Theresa May was going to serve a full term. She wasn't going to cut and run. She will now inevitably face accusations of putting party interest before country, of an opportunistic sort of scuttle to the electorate when the polls are in her favour. But she's clearly decided that is a price worth paying, given that she's got, what, a 20-point lead in some of the opinion polls at the weekend. But let's just remember what she said, at least on, well, she said it on the Andrew Marr programme. Let's have a listen to her when she was asked about a snap early election.
I think what's important, particularly having had the referendum vote, is that we have a period of stability. There's a challenge ahead in ensuring that we make a success of coming out of the European Union. I think it's important that we focus on that and the other reform agenda that I have for the country as we go forward. And we'll be continuing the manifesto on which the Conservative government was elected in 2015. So I don't think there's a need for an election. I think the next election should be in 2020.
Let me make this very clear, because again, it's very important. Under current law, the next election will be in 2020. No ifs, no buts, no snap elections, no changing the law. Under you, is that absolutely certain that we're not going to see an election before 2020?
I'm not going to be calling a snap election. I've been very clear that I think we need that period of time, that stability, to be able to deal with the issues that the country is facing and have that election in 2020.
Joanna, I'm sure it's the sort of clip which the opposition parties will be playing and referring to over and over again. Theresa May clearly there breaking her word. Reluctantly, she said she'd come to the view that it was in the national interest to go for an early general election. Well, I'm joined by Sam Coates of The Times. What do you think was the crucial factor that made Mrs May change her mind?
Well, we've had what, in the words of one of my sources, said 100% lies for weeks and weeks and weeks that there would be no early election. And yet, I have to say the logic of holding a poll now was pretty big. Theresa May is about to embark on the negotiations on Brexit. And there is just this window while Europe gets its negotiating strategy together, while the French hold their elections just ahead of the German poll in the autumn, where Theresa May could hold a, as it were, cost-free election before the negotiation heavy lifting begins, without damaging the British national interest, she will hope, and take advantage of this extraordinary polling. Now, we've had some problems with polls in the past, nobody would deny that, but what you're getting is incredibly large polling leads. We saw one from YouGov, the pollster that the Times uses over the weekend, 21-point lead, 43-22 in that poll. You had another similar-sized poll from a rival company at the weekend. And when the leads are that big, it does point to a big shift, potential for a big shift in the country. Now, in England, I think that Labour MPs will be today facing the possibility of them losing their jobs in 6 weeks' time. Lots of them. One senior figure in the Labour Party was suggesting that we could go down to 180, 170, 160 Labour MPs unless something miraculous happens based on current trends and what they've observed on the doorstep. That's down from somewhere like 230 at the moment, and that is a big and decisive change. That doesn't mean that this is a risk-free option by Theresa May. It is a gamble. She has lied. We'll have some days of her being accused of lying, and that may make her the passage of the necessary legislation or necessary motions through Parliament to authorise a general election more difficult. You've got to remember why some Tories are nervous of a general election. Now, there are basically two categories of Tory MP nervous of a general election. Some are down in the southwest who just got their seats for the first time in the 2015 general election campaign and now face a potentially resurgent Liberal Democrats eating away at their majorities. And then you have some people, perhaps on the Tory right, on the sort of Brexiteer Tory right, who didn't really want an early general election because they could see that Theresa May only currently has a working majority of 18, needs the unionists to keep on side. They could see that they had quite a lot of leverage over Theresa May at the moment. And if suddenly her majority goes up to 50, 60, 70, who knows what, in the general election in 6 weeks' time, then their negotiating power for a clean break from Europe, perhaps not even with a free trade deal with Europe, does diminish. So there are opponents, there have been opponents in her own party that will be very loyal in public today. It'll be interesting to see what stance the other opposition parties take on it. But there just was this sweet spot that she could use.
Sam Coates, thanks very much indeed, Joanna. I mean, the polls have been wrong before, but they seem to have given Mrs May a consistent lead for so long. It would be extraordinary if they are wrong again. But then who knows? Elections, referendums, they have repeatedly surprised us. So frankly, none of us should take anything for granted.
Norman, thank you. The Liberal Democrats have already said that they welcome the news that there will be a general election in June. Let's go to our chief political correspondent, Vicki Young, who I think now has reaction from Jeremy Corbyn. What's he said, Vicki?
That's right, the Labour leader, in a similar vein, saying that he welcomes the Prime Minister's decision to give the British people the chance, he says, to vote for a government that will put the interests of the majority first. He says Labour will be offering the country an effective alternative to a government that has failed to rebuild the economy, delivered falling living standards and damaging cuts to schools and the NHS. He says in the last couple of weeks, Labour has set out policies that offer a clear and credible choice for the country. And he says we look forward to showing how Labour will stand up for the people of Britain. So they will be voting with Theresa May tomorrow. That's the vote that will get her that election on June the 8th as she wants. Now, I spoke to senior Labour figures a few weeks ago about speculation about an election, and they said yes, they are ready for that fight. They believe that if Jeremy Corbyn gets out around the country, gets the publicity, they think that he can win people over. Now, as you say, the polls have not suggested that. It will be a huge test for him, someone who, of course, has been a backbench MP for most of his long career. This will be on a completely different scale to anything he's done before. The glare of the media on him relentlessly for several weeks. Of course, his supporters say that he will win people over, and that the more people see him, the more that they will like him. Now, of course, he's got a huge task. If you look at the last general election under Ed Miliband, that was a terrible result for Labour. They're going to have to try and claw their way back from that. But a big, big task for Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you very much, Vicki. Just hearing from Paul Nuttall for UKIP on Twitter. He says every vote for UKIP in this general election will be a reminder to the Prime Minister that the British people want a clean Brexit with restored borders. We're also hearing from the Scottish Labour leader, Kezia Dugdale. This country faces a significant and historic choice as we approach the UK leaving the EU. At the last election in 2015, we said this would be a clear choice between a destructive Tory party and a better future with Labour. At this election, the choice will be clear: a Tory party intent on a hard and damaging Brexit, or a Labour party that will oppose a second independence referendum and fight for a better future for everybody. Well, let's go to our Scotland correspondent, Glenn Campbell, outside the Scotland First Minister's official residence, Bute House in Edinburgh. And is there any word yet from Nicola Sturgeon?
Well, the First Minister and SNP leader, Nicola watched the Prime Minister's statement here at her official residence in Edinburgh, but she has not yet formally responded to it. The SNP, having had their best ever general election result in 2015, winning 56 of the 59 available seats in Scotland. In those circumstances, I'm not sure they would relish the possibility, the potential for an early election, and certainly their political opponents think that they could make gains in these circumstances. Of course, the SNP do want a vote of a different kind in the next 18 months to 2 years, another referendum on Scottish independence. They've requested formally from the UK government the power to hold that, and the Prime Minister's response has been that now is not the time. And I think there'll be some focus on that phrase from the SNP in their responses. The party's deputy leader, Angus Robertson, has said, well, whatever happened to now is not the time. If now is not the time for an independence referendum, the SNP, I think, will question why now is the time for a general election. But already Mr Robertson framing the contest in Scotland as a straight choice between the SNP and the Conservatives. In terms of opinion polling, the SNP remain the first place party in Scotland, the Conservatives in second place and Labour in third. The Conservative leader here, Ruth Davidson, has yet to formally respond. I think, though, she will relish the opportunity, the chance of an early general election in Scotland. You mentioned the Scottish Labour leader, Kezia Dugdale, who says the party is ready and has been preparing for a general election. She says that Labour in Scotland will start the process of selecting candidates this afternoon. And in terms of a countdown, Peter Murrell, who's the chief executive of the SNP and happens to be the husband of the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, has tweeted saying that the polls open in 50 days and 19 hours.
Thank you very much. Gosh, yes, we are right back in it, aren't we? 2 years after the last general election, June the 8th, we're headed for another one. So what do you think? Loads of you getting in touch. If you want to get in touch with me on Twitter, at BBC Joanna G. Andras Zoltan says, it makes sense for May. Renewed mandate and increased majority means Tory hard right marginalised, Labour weakened and Lib Dem surge is less. Kat Jenkins, this is depressing. It shows how power hungry the Conservatives are. They want the majority, ridding Parliament of the opposition. Anna, completely unnecessary. We voted 2 years ago. Tories got a mandate then. She was part of that. Sick of voting, waste of time and money. Aidan Fletcher, the advisors of Prime Minister, possibly project the outcome of a snap election. First past the post system gives PM the upper hand, but it is a very risky call. Well, let's bring in Professor John Curtis, who is Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. How risky is this? Because the Tories are well ahead in the polls, aren't they, at the moment?
Well, in a sense, the risk for the Prime Minister is that because the party starts so far ahead in the polls, the truth is that unless the Conservatives do emerge with, let's say, at least a majority of 100 in the House of Commons, this stratagem will be regarded as something of a failure. And to that extent, at least, the Prime Minister is going into this election with very high expectations of success. Now, maybe she will succeed, but just to repeat the warning we made earlier, if that lead just goes down to some degree, so that maybe it's around 8, 9, 10 points, well, actually, given that a 7-point lead in 2 years ago only got the Tories a majority of 12 or so, then actually the Tory majority in the House of Commons, in the new House of Commons, may not be that big. So insofar as Theresa May is trying to bolster her authority, in particular trying to ensure that her backbenchers can't make life difficult for her, let alone the opposition parties, she now needs to win big. And in a sense, the only question probably about this general election is indeed, does she succeed in winning big? Or do, in fact, the polls narrow during the course of those next 50 days or so? So, yes, she's taking a fair old gamble because she is wanting to win big. She isn't just wanting to win.
And suddenly it throws out there the possibility to voters of potentially overturning Brexit, does it? I mean, and without a general election, there was absolutely no way of that happening.
Well, that's certainly true, though, of course, the only party that's going to be campaigning, at least as far as we know, explicitly for a second referendum are the Liberal Democrats. I guess it's not surprising that Tim Farron was pretty sharp on the mark in welcoming this announcement, because he probably reckons that given that Theresa May is making Brexit, apparently, and her vision of Brexit, the central issue of this election, and the Liberal Democrats are pretty much united in being opposed to that vision, and most of them actually wanting a second referendum, he is hoping that maybe he will succeed in appealing to that at least a quarter or so of the electorate who are sometimes laboured remoaners and who would like to see the Brexit decision reversed. And given he's only got 9 MPs to start with, any improvement on that will be welcomed by Mr Farron. I think the crucial question, however, is to the extent to which Jeremy Corbyn is actually able to unite his party on Brexit and more generally on the issue of his leadership. I think the most important thing that's happened in the last half an hour, by the way, is Jeremy Corbyn's announcement that he welcomes the Prime Minister's announcement that therefore Labour are meant to be voting in favour of the motion when it comes before the House of Commons tomorrow. But I think the question we'll now be asking is, but does he succeed in taking all Labour MPs with him? Or does this general election campaign start with yet another division inside the Labour Party? Because one suspects there are some Labour MPs who perhaps are unhappy about the prospect of fighting a general election under Mr Corbyn's leadership, that they therefore are going to vote symbolically, at least, against the prospect.
Thank you, John. I can actually tell you that there is one who's come out and said that he will be voting against the snap general election. It's the Chester MP, Chris Matheson. His majority is just 93. It's the most marginal Labour seat in the country. So he said he will vote against the snap general election. But as John Curtis indicating there, with Jeremy Corbyn saying that the Labour Party welcomes the announcement by the Prime Minister that she will be calling a general election for the 8th of June, it will almost certainly go ahead, because in order for the election to go ahead, the Prime Minister needs to get it through the Commons with a 2/3 majority of MPs. This is because David Cameron introduced the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which meant that parliaments would last for a fixed term of 5 years, which would have meant that the next election wasn't going to be until 2020. But instead, that can be overridden by a majority vote in the Commons, and it does look indeed like that will be happening. So we are on course for June the 8th. Let's get some more reaction from Fraser Nelson, the editor of The Spectator. Well, were you surprised?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, for a long time, people have said perhaps Theresa May will have an early general election, but we thought that she wouldn't for 3 reasons. One is that there's a boundary review in a couple of years that would give the Tories a lot more seats if they waited. The other is, of course, that if you look at the Labour Party, it's such a mess, she doesn't need to have one right now. But most of all, she said she wouldn't. 4 or 5 times she has pledged not to have a snap election. So to break her word in such a spectacular fashion is not a good look. But also, let's remember, the great risk she now runs is that this election campaign could be a rerun of the EU referendum campaign. The Liberal Democrats will be delighted. This is the best news they've had for a very long time. So the risk is that Labour will get a lot more votes, the Lib Dems will get a lot more votes, because people who want Britain to stay in the EU will see in this a chance to kind of stop it. And that the two tribes that we saw dividing Britain and the referendum campaign last year will form again and make life a lot more difficult for the Tories than if Theresa May had waited until 2020.
Theresa May was throwing down the gauntlet to Jeremy Corbyn, saying that, well, he'd said that he would vote against any deal on Brexit if the terms weren't completely matching of the terms that the UK currently has inside the EU. It'll be, I mean, obviously we've heard that Jeremy Corbyn is welcoming the fact there'll be an election. It'll be interesting to see how they will play it.
Well, yes, I mean, this is very difficult with Jeremy Corbyn, who's got an ambivalent position on Brexit. If he was fundamentally a Remainer, he would get a lot more votes than he's likely to get now, because, as he knows, a lot of Labour voters voted for Brexit. A lot of the voters he needs to get back voted for Brexit. So, yes, Theresa May is right in thinking that Labour is in a very difficult position. Although her pretext that he was going to thwart Brexit doesn't really hold up. I think she managed to get all the Brexit legislation through the Commons pretty easily. I don't think there is really a practical reason for this election rather than the party political advantage of the Conservative Party. And I think voters will sense that. And this is the other risk Theresa May is taking. She's been telling Scotland, look, you can't have another referendum because you had a vote a few years ago. Well, now here she is putting us through a general election against her own word, and also in a way that isn't really necessary. That's the strange thing. Why does she have to have an election right now? The reason she gave this morning wasn't particularly convincing, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, on that, she was saying that she has only recently and reluctantly come to the conclusion. She said it's the only way to guarantee certainty and stability for the years ahead. Saying that opposition MPs are effectively trying to thwart Brexit and weakening Britain's hand in the negotiations by their stance.
Yes, that really doesn't stand up to any scrutiny at all. I mean, if she had had the Article 50 vote to trigger Brexit thwarted in the House of Commons or the House of Lords, then she would have been able to say, OK, let's have a general election so I can make sure the will of the people is enacted. But as it stands, she won victory after victory on that relatively easily. So I don't really think that she or anybody else can really point to this great big obstacle in the House of Commons that's stopping Brexit. Those battles had been been fought, she was winning them. This election is to make sure the Tories get a majority of about 100 odd when Labour Party looks to be at its weakest point.
Thank you very much, Fraser Nelson. We've got a tweet from Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. The Tories see a chance to move the UK to the right, force through a hard Brexit and impose deeper cuts. Let's stand up for Scotland. Hashtag GE17. That's a hashtag that we're going to be getting used to because we've now got, 6 weeks or so until the next general election. 2 years since the last one, and that dramatic statement at Downing Street this morning confirming that news. We knew just probably about half an hour or so before the statement that Theresa May would be giving it. There was absolutely no indication of what it could be, a lot of speculation around it. We knew it would be dramatic, and in the event it was, we will be having a general election on the 8th of June. Let's bring in our business presenter, Ben Thompson, with a reaction from the markets. What are they doing?
Yeah, let me do the numbers first because it's interesting. You look at all that speculation before the announcement, before we knew what it was going to be. There was a big sell-off in the pound. That's now bounced back, so that's sort of off the table. Let's look at the FTSE 100, the 100 leading companies in the UK. That's currently down about 1.5%. It's about a 2-month low, but I think it's fair to say we shouldn't expect much reaction, apart from this knee-jerk reaction we've had today, until that vote on June the 8th. I think that's when we might start to see something, unless, and it's a big caveat, unless the polls start suggesting there is weakening support for the Conservatives. And I think this is so interesting at the moment now because we get a whole lot more uncertainty. We've got a vote already in France. We've now got a vote here in the UK. Markets don't like uncertainty, and so that's what we've got in bucket loads now. But I think, as you'd expect, already we're getting reaction from big city institutions, big city banks, some of it coming into me now. One here suggesting this is just the Prime Minister wanting full control of the Brexit process. They say this allows her to do that without interference from the opposition. Another one that's just come through saying, well, this would hand Theresa May a stronger mandate to stand up to hardline anti-EU backbenchers. They say that would be welcomed by the financial markets. So clearly at this point, some uncertainty as far as what investors think happens next. Some suggesting if we see that support continue for the Conservative Party, then there won't be a huge change on the financial markets. Maybe this gives the Prime Minister a bit more power going into the negotiating process as far as Brexit is concerned. But as we stand, the FTSE 100 down 1.5%.
When she made the announcement, she outlined the current economic position of the UK and talked about strong fundamentals and much stronger fundamentals than have been predicted in the run-up to the referendum in the event of there being a vote for Brexit. But of course, Brexit hasn't actually happened. Yeah,
I mean, that's the thing we should really remember here. Those divorce proceedings are now underway, but we've not left. And therefore, there was all sorts of forecasts about what would happen to the UK economy if and when we did leave. On both sides, some pretty wild claims as part of that referendum campaign. I think it's fair to say that a lot of those have not come true. Some of the most pessimistic predictions about what would happen to the economy. We approach these Brexit negotiations in a pretty robust financial health. That will change the way that we approach the negotiations about the relationship that we may have with Europe after we've left the European Union. And I think, as we just heard there from one Citibank that sent through their statement saying this gives the Prime Minister that stronger mandate. Maybe she can fend off some of the criticism from those hardline anti-EU backbenchers. This gives her a stronger position in which to negotiate. But of course, I think we'll expect the market reaction maybe about June the 8th on that vote, or indeed if the polls suggest there is weakening support for the Tories.
Thanks very much, Ben. Let's go back to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith in Downing Street. More reaction, Norman.
Huge moment, which, let's be honest, took us all by surprise at Westminster, particularly given that Mrs May in Downing Street had repeatedly insisted that she would not cut and run for an early general election. Today, Mrs May said reluctantly and recently she had changed her mind, that an early election was in the national interest to provide certainty and stability in the run-up to the Brexit referendum. Her claim that the opposition parties were providing disunity and endangering the prospects for millions of people ahead of Brexit.
I have just chaired a meeting of the Cabinet where we agreed that the government should call a general election to be held on the 8th of June.
The shock announcement was made just an hour ago. Britain will go to the polls in 7 weeks. It comes after the firing gun was triggered for Brexit.
At this moment of enormous national significance, there should be unity here in Westminster. But instead, there is division. The country is coming together, but Westminster is not.
Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has welcomed the move, saying it gives the British people the chance to vote for a government that will put the interests of the majority first. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said she would stand up for Scotland, and the Conservatives were planning to force through a hard Brexit. Good afternoon. Welcome to BBC News on the 18th of April. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, has announced she is calling for a snap general election on the 8th of June. She had previously insisted there would be no election until 2020. But she said this morning she had reluctantly come to the conclusion that it was the only way to guarantee certainty and stability to see the country through Brexit. Explaining the decision, Mrs May said the country is coming together, but Westminster is not. Under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, the Prime Minister must ask the House of Commons to vote for an early election. That will happen tomorrow. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has confirmed his party will vote with the government and said Labour would offer an effective alternative to the Conservatives. Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has said the Tories see a chance to move the UK to the right, force through a hard Brexit and impose deeper cuts. Well, let's go to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, who's at Downing Street, and it is fair to say she caught everyone unawares, Norman.
She really did, but let's be under no illusions, Joanna. We are heading for the Brexit election. That is how Theresa May is pitching it, but she has decided to drop her previous pledge not to cut and run because she says there is a need to provide certainty and stability ahead of Brexit, to strengthen her hand in those negotiations and to counter what she sees as the attempts by opposition parties to thwart Brexit, citing not just Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the SNP, but also opposition in the House of Lords. She will know too that the opinion polls now give her an absolute colossal lead of more than 20 points over Labour, and she may well calculate it is never going to get any better for her. Let's have a listen to her statement.
I have just chaired a meeting of the Cabinet where we agreed that the government should call a general election to be held on the 8th of June. I want to explain the reasons for that decision, what will happen next, and the choice facing the British people when you come to vote in this election. Last summer, after the country voted to leave the European Union, Britain needed certainty, stability, and strong leadership. And since I became Prime Minister, the government has delivered precisely that. Despite predictions of immediate financial and economic danger, since the referendum, we have seen consumer confidence remain high, record numbers of jobs, and economic growth that has exceeded all expectations. We have also delivered on the mandate that we were handed by the referendum result. Britain is leaving the European Union, and there can be no turning back. And as we look to the future, the government has the right plan for negotiating our new relationship with Europe. We want a deep and special partnership between a strong and successful European Union and a United Kingdom that is free to chart its own way in the world. That means we will regain control of our own money, our own laws and our own borders. And we will be free to strike trade deals with old friends and new partners all around the world. This is the right approach, and it is in the national interest. But the other political parties oppose it. At this moment of enormous national significance, there should be unity here in Westminster. But instead, there is division. The country is coming together, but Westminster is not. In recent weeks, Labour have threatened to vote against the final agreement we reach with the European Union. The Liberal Democrats have said they want to grind the business of government to a standstill. The Scottish National Party say they will vote against the legislation that formally repeals Britain's membership of the European Union. And unelected members of the House of Lords have vowed to fight us every step of the way. Our opponents believe, because the government's majority is so small, that our resolve will weaken and that they can force us to change course. They are wrong. They underestimate our determination to get the job done. And I am not prepared to let them endanger the security of millions of working people across the country. Because what they are doing jeopardises the work we must do to prepare for Brexit at home. And it weakens the government's negotiating position in Europe. If we do not hold a general election now, their political game playing will continue, and the negotiations with the European Union will reach their most difficult stage in the run-up to the next scheduled election. Division in Westminster will risk our ability to make a success of Brexit, and it will cause damaging uncertainty and instability to the country. So we need a general election, and we need one now, because we have at this moment a one-off chance to get this done while the European Union agrees its negotiating position and before the detailed talks begin. I have only recently and reluctantly come to this conclusion. Since I became Prime Minister, I have said that there should be no election until 2020. But now I have concluded that the only way to guarantee certainty and stability for the years ahead is to hold this election and seek your support for the decisions I must take. And so tomorrow, I will move a motion in the House of Commons calling for a general election to be held on the 8th of June. That motion, as set out by the Fixed Term Parliament Act, will require a two-thirds majority of the House of Commons. So I have a simple challenge to the opposition parties. You have criticised the government's vision for Brexit. You have challenged our objectives. You have threatened to block the legislation we put before Parliament. This is your moment to show you mean it, to show you are not opposing the government for the sake of it, to show that you do not treat politics as a game. Let us tomorrow vote for an election. Let us put forward our plans for Brexit and our alternative programmes for government, and then let the people decide. And the decision facing the country will be all about leadership. It will be a choice between strong and stable leadership in the national interest, with me as your Prime Minister, or weak and unstable coalition government led by Jeremy Corbyn, propped up by the Liberal Democrats who want to reopen the divisions of the referendum, and Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP. Every vote for the Conservatives will make it harder for opposition politicians who want to stop me from getting the job done. Every vote for the Conservatives will make me stronger when I negotiate for Britain with the Prime Ministers, Presidents and Chancellors of the European Union. Every vote for the Conservatives will mean we can stick to our plan for a stronger Britain and take the right long-term decisions for a more secure future. It was with reluctance that I decided the country needs this election, but it is with strong conviction that I say it is necessary to secure the strong and stable leadership the country needs to see us through Brexit and beyond. So tomorrow, let the House of Commons vote for an election. Let everybody put forward their proposals for Brexit and their programmes for government. And let us remove the risk of uncertainty and instability and continue to give the country the strong and stable leadership it demands.
So Theresa May there setting out her reasons for reluctantly changing her mind about going for that snap general election, putting Brexit at the forefront of her thinking. But let's be honest, she will also hope that if the polls are right, she may be returned with a significantly larger majority, which would also hugely strengthen her position in the House of Commons, where at the moment, of course, Mrs May is permanently vulnerable to revolts. We saw that, of course, Philip Hammond forced into a humiliating U-turn over the increase in national insurance contributions. Mrs May will hope if she can increase that majority, then she will be bomb-proof from those sort of revolts and defeats in the future. But let us be honest, elections are entirely unpredictable. We've seen that at the last general election. We saw it in the Brexit referendum. You could argue we saw that in Donald Trump. You would hesitate to predict anything on the basis of opinion polls. However, given the consistency of the polls, given the fact that Mrs May won that by-election victory in Copeland when she seized what should have been a safe Labour seat, the Prime Minister may well have concluded that it is not going to get any better. Now is as good as it's going to get.
We've heard from Jeremy Corbyn, Norman, welcoming the fact that there'll be an election. In terms of Labour's stance in the election, is it clear what it would be?
I think it's a really tough election for Labour to fight. They will back the election. They will vote for the election tomorrow when Theresa May puts it to the House of Commons. It would be impossible for them to do anything else. But how do they fight that election? Theresa May clearly wants to fight it as the Brexit election. She wants to position herself as the Brexit candidate. She pretty much said as much in her statement, saying the country was coming together behind Brexit, but it was disunity at Westminster, the opposition of Labour, the SNP, members of the House of Lords who were, in her words, endangering the livelihoods of millions of people. She's almost positioning herself, it seems to me, as the anti-Westminster candidate, the sort of popular Brexit candidate. That's how she wants to fight the election. And the real challenge for Labour is, can they break out of that and pitch it more as an anti-austerity election? Can they get some of their broader messages over, or are they just pinned down as sort of the reluctant Brexiteers? That is the real difficulty for them in the forthcoming contest.
Thanks, Norman. Well, let's just read through the statement from the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. He has welcomed the announcement of a general election. He has said, "I welcome the Prime Minister's decision to give the British people a chance to vote for a government that will put the interests of the majority first. Labour will be offering the country an effective alternative to a government that has failed to rebuild the economy, delivered failing living standards and damaging cuts to our schools and the NHS." We are hoping to interview a member of the shadow cabinet, but we've not managed to get anybody yet. But we are aiming for that, of course. We've had members of the Liberal Democrats and the Tory party on the programme so far, but still no word from a front bencher on the in the Labour ranks. Well, let's go to our chief political correspondent, Vicki Young, who is in Westminster with more reaction from there. Well, it was a big surprise. How is it going down there, Vicki?
Yeah, it was a complete surprise, a complete shock, but Theresa May coming out today and saying that she felt forced into it, really. She said opposition parties and MPs were going to start messing around over Brexit, and she wants to get her own personal mandate. Let's speak now to the Conservative MP, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Crispin Blunt, who's with me now. Yeah, bit of a surprise.
A huge surprise, tactical and strategic surprise. As an ex-soldier, one can only just admire the way she has kept the confidentiality around this, and everyone is obviously astonished at the decision this morning because no one saw this coming. There's a perfectly sound case for it, which she made this morning. And of course, in terms of delivering Brexit, which is the big foreign policy decision for the country to reorientate ourselves, the country took that decision last year, but it's got to be delivered and got home. It makes a certain amount of sense then to make sure she's got a sufficient mandate from the electorate to get it done, and plainly there's the opportunity to do so, and we've got to hope that the electorate will be convinced of that case over the next few weeks.
But the 48% of people in the referendum who voted to remain, is this a chance for them to try and change the outcome, to try and change the direction of the country, as the Liberal Democrats are saying?
Well, I think that's going to be plainly the Lib Dems' pitch to the country. But they're not led by a leader who's particularly convincing, so that's obviously a big weakness for them. Doesn't look obviously remotely like a potential Prime Minister. So that's going to be quite difficult for them. And actually the opinion polls would suggest the country recognise the decision has been taken, and actually what we need to do is get on and deliver it. And I think people are quite admiring of the Prime Minister about how she's conducted the government over the last 9 months. And people who are not utterly obsessed with politics, I think, are going to look at this and go, she needs the authority to get this done. The country took a decision. And of course, people who are hugely committed to the European ideal and really get Europe here in a way that others don't, of course, I suspect they will be attracted by that. But it was a tiny minority in the Conservative Party who felt like that. I think it's actually a pretty small minority in the country. And the 48% mostly were people thinking, well, I don't really know, but it's probably the best decision overall for the country. But equally, 52% of people, many more of whom actually believed in Britain taking back its sovereignty, then took that decision. So I think she's in quite a strong place.
Some, though, accusing her of political opportunism, but she's actually looked at the opinion polls. She's 20 points ahead of Labour. She can see the problems with Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, and so she's decided to put the interests of her and her party before the country.
Well, it's in the interest of the country that we have a government with authority to deliver the biggest change in our country's global positioning for 40 years. And so I think in those terms she is serving the national interest by securing her position as Prime Minister, as she believes she will, if she puts it to the country to decide.
Do you think that she wanted a personal mandate as well? I mean, Nicola Sturgeon has made the point, hasn't she, that she has no personal mandate. It was, of course, David Cameron who won the general election in 2015. Do you think Theresa May wanted to get people to vote for her personally?
I don't actually think that would have been behind her decision. If you like, it's a kind of fringe benefit that if she does get the victory she hopes she will on the 8th of June, that it will be her victory. But for her, making the decision is actually one about the national interest and about, obviously, plainly, the national interest and the Conservative Party's interests obviously overlap if you're the Conservative Prime Minister. Of course they do. But she will see this in terms of the national interest of then having a government behind her with sufficient authority in Parliament to get this difficult process of Brexit delivered, to deliver the referendum result, the decision of last year.
Crispin Blunt, thank you very much indeed. And I think the calculations being too that the negotiations, those Brexit negotiations, won't really get underway in earnest until the autumn. So this was her last opportunity, if you like, for that general election.
Thank you, Vicki. Well, we've had a statement through from Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council, on the Brexit negotiations. The EU is saying that the negotiating guidelines it's forging for Britain's exit from the EU will not be affected by the British government's call for an early general election on June the 8th. Let's get some reaction. Actually, I should say we are expecting to hear in the next couple of minutes from Jeremy Corbyn. We're expecting an interview to come in with him, so we will bring you that as soon as it comes through. While we wait for that, let's just go to John Rentoul, who's chief political commentator at The Independent. He joins us from our studio in Westminster. Well, what's your reaction?
Well, it was very difficult to see why, as Prime Minister, facing the prospect of increasing your majority to over 100 seats, Theresa May could resist the pressure to hold an election. I thought she was going to. She took everyone by surprise. It was slightly awkward because she had to blame the opposition parties for causing disunity at Westminster as the reason why she had only recently and reluctantly changed her mind. But it's worth that temporary awkwardness, I think, for the prospect of gaining a huge personal mandate for herself in domestic politics, but also in her negotiations with Europe. I mean, Donald Tusk, who just said there, says it doesn't make any difference, but actually it does make a difference. If Theresa May does win a large majority in a general election, she has more authority then in her negotiations with our European partners.
It's not certain, though, is it? I mean, you know, obviously always unpredictable. The polls at this stage are saying what they're saying, but we're going into uncharted territory again, aren't we?
Well, I mean, personally, I think the opinion polls are flattering the Labour Party at the moment, and I think Theresa May takes that view too. And the last time Labour touched as low as 23% in a national opinion poll was just before the 1983 general election, when Margaret Thatcher won a 144-seat majority. And I think Labour's actually in a weaker position today than it was then, because you know, a majority of Labour MPs can hardly, with their hands on their heart, go to their constituents and say,
John Rentoul, I'm so sorry, I'm going to interrupt you because we are expecting to hear from Jeremy Corbyn right now. So let's just take a look.
for this to be a general election?
I welcome the opportunity for us to put the case to the people of Britain, to stand up against this government and its failed economic agenda, which has left our NHS in problems, which has left our schools underfunded, which has left so many people uncertain. We want to put a case out there for the people of Britain of a society that cares for all, an economy that works for all, and a Brexit that works for all.
Labour's been consistently behind in opinion polls, so you're not particularly in a strong starting place. Would you concede that? Would you concede that you face an uphill struggle from here?
We're going out there to put the case of how this country could be run, how it could be different, how we could have a much fairer society that works for all, for everybody in our community. That's the case we're putting, and I'm looking forward to doing it.
So what will you be doing then over the coming weeks to turn around the polls and secure a Labour victory?
We're putting the case out there to deal with the housing crisis, to deal with the education funding crisis, to deal with the National Health Service, but above all, about an economy that works for all by investment in our infrastructure, investment in our manufacturing industries, to give real hope and real opportunities for everybody in this country.
Labour lost the general election just 2 years ago. What's different about your offering to the country this time round?
We're challenging the economic narrative which says that there has to be huge cuts in public expenditure in order to pay for the banking crisis of 2008. We're saying instead, invest in the economy, invest in the future. We are a party that will put forward a case that will bring about a much fairer, much more decent country than we're getting at the present time, where we have massive inequalities between the very rich minority and, sadly, too many people living in desperate poverty at the other end of the scale.
The 8th of June, does that give you enough time to get that message out there?
I'm starting straight away and I'm looking forward to it. We will take our message to every single part of this country and we'll challenge the government to debate these issues in every town and city in this country.
If Labour loses this election, will you stand down as Labour?
We are campaigning to win this election. That's the only question now.
Are you the next Prime Minister?
If we win the election, yes, and I want to lead a government that will transform this country, give real hope to everybody, and above all, bring about a principle of justice for everybody and economic opportunities for everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeremy Corbyn, his first reaction to the news that the general election now 7 weeks away, the 8th of June. Let's go to our chief political correspondent, Vicki Young in Westminster. And Vicki, Jeremy Corbyn saying he welcomes the election. All the main parties now saying they welcome it. They were surprised on the back foot, but it will be happening.
Yeah, I mean, there have been some speculation, but not based on very much in recent weeks. And Labour have always said they're on an election footing, that they're ready. And as the main opposition party, really, it would be very hard to justify keeping the Conservatives in power. So he is going to tell his MPs to vote for a general election on June the 8th. Who doesn't like that vote will go through tomorrow. Let's see how Labour MPs are reacting to all of that. I'm joined by Stephen Kinnock. Now, you are in the fortunate position you've got quite a safe seat in South Wales. But what about a lot of your colleagues? A lot of them could lose their seats.
Well, I got elected 2 years ago, and there are some absolutely fantastic colleagues, and what they all do is stand up for their constituents. They are a strong voice for their constituents in Westminster and strong local campaigners, and we're going to fight for every single vote. And I think we're going to very much fight on that platform of standing up for our communities, standing up for our constituents. If you look at what's been happening in my constituency of Aberavon with the steel crisis, I think we've managed a combination of trade unions and Labour MPs have really fought a rearguard action on steel and have actually managed to turn things around. So I think we've shown what we can do, even in opposition, to be a strong local voice and strong campaigners, and that's how we're going to fight this election.
But in recent by-elections, lots of Labour MPs knocking on doors have said that Jeremy Corbyn is not a vote winner for the party, and he will be the figurehead who will be on the TV and news bulletins and newspapers for the next 6 weeks. Is he going to be a vote winner for the Labour Party?
Well, Theresa May stood on the steps of Downing Street today and said she wanted a united Westminster, and I found those words to be quite chilling, actually, because that seems to suggest that she wants to turn our country into some kind of elective dictatorship where there's no opposition in Westminster, where the government isn't held to account, where they steamroll a Brexit through. She's being run by a cabal of Brextremists around her who want to turn this country into a European version of the Cayman Islands, using Brexit as a vehicle for doing that. So I think if people want a strong opposition, they want an opposition that's holding Theresa May to account, then they need to vote Labour on the 8th of June.
But I've spoken to some Labour MPs in the last few weeks who said they would vote for a general election, knowing they think that Labour will do badly, but hoping it will get rid of Jeremy Corbyn as leader.
Well, I think one of the things we've learned from the last 2 years in British politics and indeed in global politics is making forecasts is a mug's game. We've now got to get onto an election footing, get those leaflets printed, get those door-knocking schedules sorted out and show what the Labour Party can do as a local campaigning force to really make a difference in our constituencies and here in Westminster. And I think what Theresa May has done today is talked a good game about uniting the country, but actually at a time when we more than anything need stability, continuity and certainty for the British economy, she's thrown a hand grenade into all of that. And I think people will take a look at that and say, well, do we really want a Prime Minister who is putting party interests ahead of the national interest, or do we want a strong opposition campaigning for us here in Westminster, holding the government to account and making sure that we don't have a Brexit which turns our country into a tax dodgers paradise, into a deregulator's haven?
Just in a word, do your constituents think Jeremy Corbyn can be the next Prime Minister?
Well, look, we will find that out on the 8th of June. I'm going to fight a campaign in Aberavon based on my record as a local MP, shouting here for the interests of my people.
OK. Stephen Kinnock, thank you very much indeed. And I think that will be the approach from many Labour MPs who haven't, of course, backed their leader over recent years. They will be very much fighting local campaigns.
Thank you very much, Vicki. We're just hearing comments from the Prime Minister's spokesperson saying that the Prime Minister spoke to the Queen by telephone yesterday to tell her of her intention to call an early election, and the spokesperson also saying she has the full backing of her top team of ministers for the early election. There was a cabinet meeting this morning. They were all briefed then, and we're hearing that she's saying that she has the support of all of them. Let me just tell you a tweet that we're just getting from Donald Tusk. It was Hitchcock who directed Brexit. First an earthquake and then the tension rises. So that slightly surreal tweet through from Donald Tusk. We heard from him, or at least his spokesperson just a little while ago, saying, focusing on what happens in terms of the negotiations on Brexit, saying that all of that remains unchanged. The negotiating guidelines for Brexit aren't changed by this call for an early election. But there you go, slightly surreal tweet from Donald Tusk. It was Hitchcock who directed Brexit. First an earthquake and the tension rises. OK, let's get some reaction now from Northern Ireland. We can go to Belfast and our correspondent Chris Page. So Chris, over to you.
Yes, well, Northern Ireland parties are now facing what will be their third election in a little over a year. Already this year we've had a snap election to the Stormont Assembly in March, and then the last Stormont election was just last year. So we are now looking at yet another election, and all this is coming in the midst of what is the worst political crisis Northern Ireland has faced in the last 10 years. Now, the devolved government, the power-sharing partnership between the Democratic Unionist Party and Sinn Féin, collapsed in January. Northern Ireland's been without a government since then. In the election which was held here in March, there was a significant shift in the political landscape. The nationalist vote surged. Unionists for the first time lost their overall majority of seats in the Stormont chamber, and Sinn Féin came within a whisker of toppling the DUP as the largest party. Now, what does that mean for this election? Well, I think that it will mean that more than ever before, this general election will be more about unionism versus nationalism, orange versus green. The key question will be, can Sinn Féin sustain their support, or will unionists regain ground? Now, in the last Westminster election a little over 2 years years ago. The two main unionist parties, the DUP and the Ulster Unionist Party, formed a pact in several constituencies to avoid splitting the unionist vote, and as a result of that, at least 2 seats went to unionists, which otherwise probably would have gone to non-unionists. So I think it's likely that at the moment unionists will be considering again going for another pact, trying to maximise unionist representation at Westminster and minimise nationalist representation. We've already had a brief reaction from the leader of the DUP, Arlene Foster. She has said that the general election will be a chance for people in Northern Ireland to vote for the Union. Gerry Adams, the Sinn Féin president, has tweeted that Sinn Féin are up for another election. The broader political question in Northern Ireland is what will happen to the negotiations to restore devolved government. Several deadlines have already been missed. Negotiations have paused over the Easter break. They're due to resume next week. But the government has said that if there's no agreement between the Stormont parties by early May, then they only have 2 options. One is the one which is already accounted for in law, and that is for yet another Stormont election, or Westminster will have to take over running Northern Ireland, suspend devolution and bring in what's known as direct rule. So the calling of another election, which is likely to be another divisive election, certainly I don't think isn't going to improve the chances of a deal at Stormont, as parties at election time here tend to retreat. They tend to take up more hardline positions. So the prospects for an agreement probably haven't been helped. But the bigger question is what now will happen over the 2 weeks before the election campaign kicks in fully. Will we have a return to direct rule legislation passed in the House of Commons for that? Or will we have another Stormont election called and yet another opportunity for voters in Northern Ireland to head to the polls?
Thank you very much, Chris. What do you think? If you want to let us know your thoughts, you can get in touch with me via Twitter at BBC Joanna G. Now, if you're just joining us, let me bring you right up to date with all of the latest developments following on from the dramatic announcement from Theresa May in Downing Street this morning that she is going to be calling a general election for the 8th of June. The political process will get underway in the Commons tomorrow. It is a process that needs to happen because there is a rule now that elections should take place every 5 years, fixed term for parliaments of 5 years. So that needs to be overridden in the Commons in order to allow an early election to go ahead. June the 8th, so 7 weeks away. And the Prime Minister said in calling that she had only recently and reluctantly come to the conclusion that an early election is the only way to guarantee certainty and stability for the years ahead. She said that the government is determined to get the job of Brexit done, and she said that opposition politicians have been trying to thwart that in threatening to vote against the government's position on Brexit. She said that the government's negotiating position in Europe had been weakened by political opposition. It's worth looking at the polls and how they stand currently. The Conservative Party currently 21 points ahead of Labour. In the latest poll, it was a Comrades poll for the Independent, which gave the Tories 46% of the vote share, 25% for Labour, 11% for the Liberal Democrats. And that gave the Tory party the greatest lead while in government since 1983. As a result of that, Theresa May is being accused of political opportunism. She says this is what is in the best interests of the country. Well, let's take a closer look at the constitutional implications of the Prime Minister's announcement with Julia McRae, the Deputy Director of the Institute for Government, joining us live from central London. What is your perspective on where we're now heading?
Well, I think we took everyone by surprise today. And now looking forward, the process in some ways is just going to feel like any general election we've had over the years. The Prime Minister has made an announcement. The country is looking forward to a vote on the 8th of June. But it is actually quite different, the technical way the Prime Minister is ending up calling this election. She hasn't actually been able to do it just under her own authority. That used to be how the UK system worked. She's asking Parliament if it agrees that she can have an election. And that vote will be tomorrow. I think most people expect that she will get the 2/3 majority she needs at that point. And then the Queen will issue a proclamation setting the election date. And the political parties, no doubt, will start their campaigning well in advance of that.
She spoke after becoming Prime Minister of the need for stability after the uncertainty of what lay ahead following on from the referendum result. Is it right now to call an election in the country's best interest in order for there to be a clear mandate?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of factors in this. I mean, obviously the Prime Minister spoke a lot about Brexit. and the potential for the opposition parties voting against and things like that. She didn't really mention the potential for her own backbench to vote against various parts of the agreement, but I'm sure that will have been in her mind. But there'll also be other calculations here. The actual implementation of Brexit is going to take a long time. So everyone's been focusing on the 2 years for what's called the divorce agreement, leaving Europe, and we will almost certainly leave the EU formally in 2019. But actually the implementation of the new systems around immigration, around customs, all of that may take quite a bit longer. And I suspect the Prime Minister was thinking that this gives her a good 5 years to actually do the negotiations, implement the changes, and then return to the country on a platform which saying, this is what Brexit was, I've delivered it, and this is how it has changed things. A 2020 election, which she would have been locked into otherwise, would actually have proved to be quite soon, perhaps for showing people that things had really changed, even though it seems such a long way off.
We've heard from the President of the EU, Donald Tusk's spokesman, saying that what is being done on the EU part in terms of preparing for Brexit continues unaffected by this. But it kind of puts it all on the back burner here, does it? For 6 to 7 weeks at least.
Well, I don't think it'll make that much difference to the actual timelines for the negotiation. The EU has already got very major general elections happening. There's the French one coming up in a few weeks' time. The Germans have a general election in September. There's a lot that won't really happen on the high political scene until those elections are out of the way. The more detailed technical preparations, they will simply continue. In the background, the UK Civil Service, the European Commission will continue to do the work that's necessary to prepare to lay the scene for the big political negotiations, which are going to come, 6 months or so's time is when they'll really be joined. So it doesn't really change that timeline for negotiations very much. Again, that will probably be something in Theresa May's mind. Get Article 50, the triggering of that out of the way, and then take this space before the real in-earnest negotiations start.
It's interesting looking on Twitter how people are reacting to the fact that we're going to be having a second general election in 2 years. We of course had the referendum last year. There was the Scottish independence referendum. It seems like a time of a lot of votes, a lot of uncertainty potentially. Gary Chapman has got in touch to say the Conservatives will almost certainly win, but it's a brave thing to do. Look what happened to David Cameron on Brexit. Susan Karanja, my sister, was so disappointed she couldn't vote to remain. Now she is 18, she's excited to set that right. Will the young make a difference? Neil Hoff, if she thinks people will just vote on Brexit, what about things happening in the country like NHS and the punishment of the poor? I mean, just looking obviously at the sort of select people who are sort of self-selecting, getting in touch via Twitter, who are interested and engaged. There's a lot of good debate on there about what the implications of another vote will be. It'll be interesting to see, though, if there is such a high level of engagement around the country and things like turnout, how people feel about it.
Yeah, I think people just generally don't like elections, and for a lot of people they'll have local elections coming up on in May, start of May, and then a general election start of June. Not to mention anyone who lives in Northern Ireland who seem to be in a perpetual election cycle. People really don't like that. But that being said, most people who are really into politics, they've been speculating about this for quite some time. For the general public, this will come as a bit of a surprise, and I'm sure the Prime Minister will be hoping, though, that they can see her point, that they can see this as giving stability to the country over Brexit. I'm sure, though, that others will be trying to talk about some of the other huge issues for the country.
So sorry, I want to interrupt you because we are just going to hear from Tim Farron, the leader of the Liberal Democrats in Truro.
Who decide that they do not want a hard Brexit, they want to keep Britain in the single market, and indeed it's an opportunity for us to have a decent, strong opposition in this country that we desperately need. You only get those things with the Liberal Democrats. Indeed, only through the Liberal Democrats is there any pathway for the Conservatives losing their majority.
Theresa May says it's the right time. Is it the right time for the Liberal Democrats?
Well, we've been calling for an early general election since Theresa May became Prime Minister without there being an election last summer. So it's an opportunity for the country, more importantly, to say this is the direction they want the country to go in, not the direction, the extreme direction that Theresa May is taking us in.
The Prime Minister obviously thinks this is a good time for the Tory party. Is it likely to be a good time for you, perhaps with Remainers being unhappy out there?
Well, I think across the country, people will want to express their view that Britain, whether we are in or out of the European Union, we want to remain in the single market. Theresa May has no mandate to take us out of the single market and for a hard Brexit. It is also the opportunity for the British people to have a decent, strong opposition, something with Labour they now currently do not have.
Are you organised? Are you ready for this fight?
Liberal Democrats have candidates selected right across the country. We were prepared for an election that we thought was going to happen in autumn, and Liberal Democrats are always prepared. Here we are in Cornwall, the place where our fight back really began almost immediately after the general election 2 years ago. From this springboard, we have the opportunity to give the British people the chance to change the direction of our country, to be opposed to a hard Brexit, keep us in the single market and give Britain the decent, strong opposition that it desperately needs.
Let's talk about Cornwall. You were wiped out here in that last election that you just mentioned.
I can't affect the result of the last election. I can jolly well affect the result of the next one, and the team here today are there to do just that.
Most people in Cornwall, I think, will find voted for Brexit.
And across the country, most people, in fact all people, will not ask their opinion on whether we remain in the single market. As the evidence now becomes clear, this is an opportunity for the British people to say whether you're in or out of the European Union, we desperately need to be in the single market. We're the only party giving the British people that opportunity.
Were you surprised by Theresa May's announcement? Did you have any inkling?
Well, I always assumed that she would go for an early election at some point. I thought that she needed a mandate of her own, and after she was elected, or rather appointed Tory leader last summer. But of course, like the rest of us today, has come as a surprise. Luckily, we're prepared.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank
We've
you.
got a live for the Daily Politics any minute now, so you go and we'll set you up for that.
Sure, yeah. Hey.
The Prime Minister needs a
OK, well, that's Tim Farron, who is enjoying this moment. This is something he wanted to happen. He has repeatedly said that the referendum result that voted through Brexit did not clearly indicate exactly whether people wanted to leave the single market or not. So let's go back to Julia McCrae, Deputy Director of the Institute for Government. Julia McCrae, will we get clarity on, I mean, as I say, Tim Farron has sort of repeatedly said ever since the referendum result, well, people didn't actually mean they wanted hard Brexit. It was more about staying in the single market. I mean, it's not clear exactly what people's intentions were, whether they even had that in mind at the referendum when they were voting in the referendum. Will we get complete clarity going forward as a result of this general election about exactly what the country wants to see?
Yeah, well, I think this will be actually in many ways quite helpful. General elections, parties put out manifestos. They go into a lot more detail about what they really are standing for, exactly where they are on things like, are we in or out of the single market? What should an immigration system look like? How will we trade with the rest of the world? All of those things can be spelt out, and a government can come into Parliament saying, this is what we were elected to do. A referendum with a simple yes, no. I mean, there's been a lot of people speculating about what the British public really meant. This will actually give us a general election which will elect a government which can claim to have a mandate to implement in detail what it wants to do. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays. Obviously, Brexit is something the Liberal Democrats, you heard it there, are very keen to play from the other side of the debate to Theresa May. Labour will no doubt want to talk a lot about the spending situation in the UK, where there's real pressure on public services and real issues going on. And in Scotland, no doubt this will be used as a referendum on whether there should be a second referendum for Scottish independence. So I think there'll be a lot of moving parts to this election campaign.
Yep. We've got 7 weeks to see it all play out. Thank you very much, Julia McCrae. Let me just tell you that Donald Tusk has tweeted again. He said he's had a good phone call with Theresa May on the upcoming UK elections. That just through. He'd previously put out quite a surreal tweet saying that it was Hitchcock who directed Brexit, first an earthquake and the tension rises. He's certainly right about the tension rising. It was an unexpected announcement from the Prime Minister in Downing Street earlier. We knew she was going to be making a significant announcement. No prior detail was given about what it would be. A lot of speculation around it, and in the event, it was the fact that we are now heading for a snap general election the 8th of June. Earlier, our chief political correspondent spoke to the Conservative MP Ian Duncan-Smith and Alistair Carmichael of the Lib Dems to get their reaction.
Well, I think everyone will be surprised because the hands of the Prime Minister are always to keep this quiet until she announces it. I think she's made the right choice. I think the public has got enough time to realise that with Theresa May they've got somebody very focused, very clear. She makes a decision, she has real strong leadership. But I think she's right also that at the moment we have a government that was elected before the referendum, and it means right now we have a problem because in the Lords there's been a lot of talk about delaying and blocking this and making it very difficult to get it through. She's right to clear the air, to have a mandate to come back and say, right, the British people want us to get on with this so that we can negotiate properly in Europe, and I think that's the right thing to do from a position of strength.
But there is a risk here. I mean, only just over half of the British people who voted wanted to leave the EU. If she makes this about Brexit again, isn't there a risk?
It's not about Brexit, it's about electing a government with a strong mandate to both get on with Brexit but also to carry on with normal domestic business. And the key thing about all of this is the reason for this general election is that right now there is a disproportionate state in the House of Lords which has now got a chance to vote on this. For example, you have 100 members of the House of Lords who are Liberal peers, but only 9 members of the House of Commons. So I think resetting that balance and making it very clear that you have a mandate in the Commons for Theresa May and the government to get on and run this so that we actually have a proper, strong, stable government over the next 5 years, which is both able to do Brexit, but also strong enough to do good domestic legislation.
I'll come back to Alistair in a second, but before that, actually, the real reason is that Labour are polling 20 points behind the Tories. Jeremy Corbyn's leadership is in trouble. Theresa May's looked at that and realised she can make a lot of gains.
Yeah, I think that's a secondary issue. I think the reality is that she really feels strongly that she needs that mandate. Now, of course, the Labour Party has its own particular problems, and I suspect there'll be a number of Labour MPs who will want also to see this general election for internal reasons. But the reality is that for Theresa May, this is a bold, strong, serious decision made by somebody who has complete confidence in their leadership. And I think the public, as they've shown in the polls about her personally, really genuinely feels that she is the right kind of person to lead them.
Her polling ratings are high, aren't they?
Ian says that this is the reason. It's no such thing. What you've heard from him is the excuse. The House of Lords did not stand in the way of the government when it came to triggering the Article 50. She got what she wanted through that, albeit that even that limited provision had to be brought kicking and screaming from her as a result of a court case. So, you know, it is opportunistic. She is doing something now that she said categorically she was not going to do. But this is how she has operated since day one. She is trying to run this country not from our national interest, but from the narrow party advantage of the Conservatives. This is just the most recent example of it. It is utterly opportunistic, but I tell you, it is an opportunity for the Liberal Democrats, and we are not going to pass it up.
But for you, you may well make some gains, but if she is heading for a landslide, as the polls suggest, what difference can you make?
The only way that you will stop a Conservative landslide, and you have to be very careful about trying to predict the future in politics these days.
As the polls suggest.
But the only thing that will stand in the way of a Conservative landslide is Liberal Democrats taking back the seats that we lost to them in 2015. That is happening week in, week out in council by-elections up and down the country. You will see that happen again, I believe, come the general election day.
Well, that was a reaction from the Liberal Democrats and Ian Duncan-Smith for the Tories earlier. Let's go to Gideon Skinner from the polling company Ipsos Mori, joining us from central London. And Theresa May has called this election knowing that the Conservatives are riding high in the polls. The latest polling putting the Tories 21 points ahead of Labour. Does that make it a sort of dead cert for the Tories? What are the risks?
Well, I don't think any pollster is ever going to call anything a dead cert. Clearly, the Conservatives are in a strong position. They have been since Theresa May was elected, was made Prime Minister, and even before then. But it's not without risk. We don't know how the public are going to react to this announcement, and the Conservatives have had a strong lead. Her personal ratings in particular are very good. Her honeymoon has lasted a lot longer than, say, for example, her predecessors, David Cameron, or even for Gordon Brown. So we need to see how it's going to play out over the next couple of weeks.
Stay with us, because I just want to bring reaction from Nicola Sturgeon. She has just been speaking, so let's listen to her.
First Minister, is now the right time for a UK general election?
Well, this is the biggest U-turn in recent political history, but it's very clear that the Prime Minister's announcement today is one all about the narrow interests of her own party, not the interests of the country overall. Clearly she sees the opportunity, given the total disarray in the ranks of the Labour Party, to crush all opposition to her, to get rid of people that disagree with her, and to give herself a free hand to take the country in the increasingly right-wing direction that she wants to take it in. And that would mean not just the hardest possible Brexit, but more austerity and deeper cuts. So now is the time for Scotland's voice to be heard, and for people in Scotland to stand up for the kind of country we want Scotland to be. And that's the campaign that I look forward to leading in the weeks ahead.
Given your calls for another independence referendum and your resistance to Theresa May's approach to Brexit, are you partly responsible for this early vote?
Well, I make no apology, and I don't think anybody would expect me to, for standing up for how people in Scotland by majority voted in the EU referendum, which was against Brexit at all, but particularly against a hard Brexit. Now, I think when you listen to Theresa May's statement this morning, it's that democratic opposition, which is healthy in any democracy, that she sees the opportunity to crush. And that would not be, I think, a good way forward, and would not be in Scotland's interest. The question of what kind of country we want to be is going to very much be at stake in this election campaign, and whether we want that to be a country, the future of which is steered and directed by a Tory party moving ever more to the right, or whether we want the people of Scotland to be in charge. So this is an opportunity to make Scotland's voice heard, and make sure that we have MPs from Scotland that will first and foremost be about fighting Scotland's corner.
Well, might the Tories crush at least some of your gains from the last general election this time around?
Well, we'll be defending all of the seats that we won last time around, and I'll be fighting this election to win. I think the Prime Minister has called this election for selfish, narrow party political interests, but she has called it, and therefore I relish the prospect of getting out there, standing up for Scotland's interests and values, standing up for Scotland's voice being heard, and standing against the ability of a right-wing Conservative Party to impose whatever policies it wants in Scotland. So I relish the prospect.
Will you seek a fresh mandate for an independence referendum in the context of Brexit?
I've got a mandate for a second independence referendum. I won that mandate at the Scottish Parliament elections last year, and of course the Scottish Parliament has since voted by majority for that position. So that mandate is there and it's clear. This election will be about the kind of country we want Scotland to be, and whether we want the Tories to have a free hand in determining that, or whether we want to make sure that we stand up for Scotland's public services, for public spending, against further Tory austerity. These are the issues that will be to the fore in this campaign, and I look forward to leading a campaign on them.
But will you have a specific commitment in your manifesto for this election promising another independence referendum within 18 months to 2 years?
My position on a second independence referendum is clear, and it will continue to be clear throughout this campaign. It is, as I set out in this very room just a few weeks ago, that when the time is right, it should be for Scotland to determine our own future, not for a Tory government to determine that future for us. So that position is the one that we will take into this election, and the one that we will have after this election as well.
It will be in your manifesto?
I'll set out our manifesto in due course, but the position on the referendum will be the one that I set out in this room just a few weeks ago.
When will you tell us your next move towards securing the power to have that vote?
Well, I had planned to do that over the next few weeks, and that is still the assumption I'm working on. Clearly, we have a development today that changes the nature and the shape of the next few weeks. So I'll consider the timing of that in the context of the election campaign, and of course I'll set out that to Parliament in due course.
Can either Natalie McGarry or Michelle Thompson be SNP candidates in this election?
Well, the SNP's National Executive Committee will meet over the next few days to set the terms of candidates' selection, and these matters, as well as a number of other matters, will be discussed by the National Executive Committee in the proper way.
And for the record, maybe academic, will SNP MPs vote for this election when Theresa May brings it to the House tomorrow?
Well, we're not going to stand in the way of an election, albeit we think it's an election called for very cynical, selfish, party political reasons. But, you know, it's clear that Labour is not going to vote against it, nor, I think, are the Liberals. But I think people will judge Theresa May on the reasons for calling this election, and that will be a factor in how people choose to vote.
Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. Let's just bring you some reaction from the Plaid Cymru leader Leanne Wood. Plaid Cymru is united. We're up for the opportunity to advocate for Wales' best interests. The more Plaid Cymru MPs, the stronger Wales' voice will be. The official opposition is divided and unable to agree a position on the most important of decisions. Let's go back to Gideon Skinner from Ipsos Mori just briefly. Gideon Skinner, does this become effectively another referendum on EU membership? Will people vote with Brexit in the front of their minds?
Well, we know that Brexit is the single most important issue facing the country. In fact, it's higher than we've ever seen concern about Europe over since the 1970s. But that doesn't mean it's the only issue. Concern about the NHS is high. We know that there's more pessimism about the future of public services than we've seen for a long time. So Brexit is going to be key. There's a lot of confidence in Theresa May on the way that she's handling Brexit, but it's not going to be the only issue.
Gideon Skinner, thank you very much. Well, it was an unexpected statement from the Prime Minister this morning when she announced that she would be calling a general election for the 8th of June, 7 weeks away. Previously, she had said she would not call a slap election. She said it was important that there be stability. But this is how she made the announcement in Downing Street this morning.
I have just chaired a meeting of the Cabinet where we agreed that the government should call a general election to be held on the 8th of June. I want to explain the reasons for that decision, what will happen next, and the choice facing the British people when you come to vote in this election. Last summer, after the country voted to leave the European Union, Britain needed certainty, stability, and strong leadership. And since I became Prime Minister, the government has delivered precisely that. Despite predictions of immediate financial and economic danger, since the referendum we have seen consumer confidence remain high, record numbers of jobs, and economic growth that has exceeded all expectations. We have also delivered on the mandate that we were handed by the referendum result. Britain is leaving the European Union, and there can be no turning back. And as we look to the future, the government has the right plan for negotiating our new relationship with Europe. We want a deep and special partnership between a strong and successful European Union and a United Kingdom that is free to chart its own way in the world. That means we will regain control of our own money, our own laws and our own borders. And we will be free to strike trade deals with old friends and new partners all around the world. This is the right approach, and it is in the national interest. But the other political parties oppose it. At this moment of enormous national significance, there should be unity here in Westminster. But instead, there is division. The country is coming together, but Westminster is not. In recent weeks, Labour have threatened to vote against the final agreement we reach with the European Union. The Liberal Democrats have said they want to grind the business of government to a standstill. The Scottish National Party say they will vote against the legislation that formally repeals Britain's membership of the European Union. And unelected members of the House of Lords have vowed to fight us every step of the way.
Theresa May with that dramatic announcement at Downing Street this morning that she plans to call a general election for the 8th of June, an announcement she says is in the national interest. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has welcomed the news of an election. Scotland's First Minister said it could be a huge political miscalculation. Thank you for your company. You've been watching BBC News. And coming up, Sophie Rayworth will have all the latest reaction and analysis live from Westminster with the 1 o'clock news. Right now, though, let's catch up with the weather with Louise Lear.
Good afternoon. It may well have been a chilly start, but there's some lovely spring sunshine out there. Just take a look at this Weather Watchers picture in Leicestershire. But I could have showed you numerous shots today because we've got sunshine through eastern Scotland, the whole of England and Wales. A little more cloud into Northern Ireland this afternoon and eventually some rain pushing into the far northwest of Scotland. Here it's still on the chilly side with 8 or 9 degrees, but highest values of 14 in the southeast corner. Now, as we go through the night where we've had the clear skies by day, those temperatures are really going to drop off very quickly indeed. The exception will be Northern Ireland and Scotland. Here we keep more cloud and temperatures perhaps holding up a little, but elsewhere we're going to see lows down to -4 degrees. A widespread hard frost is possible in some places. Not great news for those young, tender spring plants out there. At least there will be plenty of sunshine again across England and Wales. A band of cloud into North Wales and Northern England eventually. Brighter for Scotland and not quite as cold.
The Prime Minister calls for a snap general election to be held on Thursday, June the 8th. In a surprise announcement, Theresa May said she had recently and reluctantly come to the decision in order to see the UK through Brexit and beyond.
At this moment of enormous national significance, there should be unity here in Westminster. But instead, there is division. The country is coming together, but Westminster is not.
The general election will need parliamentary approval. MPs will vote on that tomorrow. Labour say they will back it.
We're going out there to put the case of how this country could be run, how it could be different, how we could have a much fairer society that works for all, for everybody in our community. That's the case we're putting, and I'm looking forward to doing it.
Scotland's First Minister says the Prime Minister is trying to move the UK to the right and to force through a hard Brexit. On the markets, the pound fell ahead of Mrs May's statement, then rose during her speech. The EU says the call for an election will not change plans for Britain's exit from the European Union.
And we'll have more reaction to the Prime Minister's plans for a snap general election on June the 8th throughout the day here on BBC News.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1 live from Downing Street. Well, there is surprise in Westminster this lunchtime after the Prime Minister dramatically announced plans for a snap general election to be held on Thursday, June the 8th. Standing here in Downing Street a short time ago, Theresa May said that Britain needed certainty, stability and strong leadership following the EU referendum. She said she had reluctant the conclusion that a vote was necessary because the country is coming together, but Westminster is not. Well, the Prime Minister still needs parliamentary approval in order to formally call the election, and MPs will vote on that tomorrow. Our first report this afternoon is from our political correspondent, Ben Wright.
Out of the blue, Number 10 announced there'd be a statement from the Prime Minister. Out of the blue, Theresa May stunned Westminster and the country with this.
I have just chaired a meeting of the Cabinet where we agreed that the government should call a general election to be held on the 8th of June.
The next general election was not due until 2020, but Theresa May said a poll was needed now. The reason she gave? To bring political stability to Brexit.
At this moment of enormous national significance, there should be unity here in Westminster. But instead, there is division. The country is coming together, but Westminster is not. In recent weeks, Labour have threatened to vote against the final agreement we reach with the European Union. The Liberal Democrats have said they want to grind the business of government to a standstill. The Scottish National Party say they will vote against the legislation that formally repeals Britain's membership of the European Union. And unelected members of the House of Lords have vowed to fight us every step of the way. Our opponents believe, because the government's majority is so small, that our resolve will weaken and that they can force us to change course. They are wrong.
The Prime Minister said she had only recently and reluctantly decided to call an election, but said the political choice was now stark.
It will be a choice between strong and stable leadership in the national interest, with me as your Prime Minister, or weak and unstable coalition government led by Jeremy Corbyn, propped up by the Liberal Democrats who want to reopen the divisions of the referendum, and Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP. Every vote for the Conservatives will make it harder for opposition politicians who want to stop me from getting the job done.
Prime Ministers now have to get the approval of Parliament before they can call a snap election. A two-thirds majority of MPs is needed, and Labour will back the Prime Minister's move in the Commons tomorrow. This morning, Jeremy Corbyn said he was ready for the election fight.
I welcome the opportunity for us to put the case to the people of Britain, to stand up against this government and its failed economic agenda, which has left our NHS in problems, which has left our schools underfunded, which has left so many people uncertain. We want to put a case out there for the people of Britain of a society that cares for all, an economy that works for all, and a Brexit that works for all.
The First Minister of Scotland, the SNP's Nicola Sturgeon, said the Prime Minister was trying to force through a so-called hard Brexit.
The Prime Minister's announcement today is one all about the narrow interests of her own party, not the interests of the country overall. You know, clearly she sees the opportunity, given the total disarray in the ranks of the Labour Party, to crush all opposition to her, to get rid of people that disagree with her, and to give herself a free hand to take the country in the increasingly right-wing direction that she wants to take it in.
The Lib Dems, too, will fight against the government strategy for Brexit.
Well, it's an opportunity for the people of this country to change the direction of this country, to decide that they do not want a hard Brexit, they want to keep Britain in the single market, and indeed it's an opportunity for us to have a decent, strong opposition in this country that we desperately need.
The UKIP leader Paul Nuttall welcomed the general election, but make no mistake, he said, this was a decision driven by the weakness of Labour, not the good of the country. And Labour certainly goes into this election a very long way behind the Tories in the opinion polls. Labour MPs in marginal seats are likely to be sweating at what could be seen by some as an audacious political ambush by Theresa May. So she's rolled the dice, she's confident she will win, but politics has never been less predictable and a lot can happen in a 6-week campaign. Ben Wright, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, I'm joined here by our assistant political editor, Norman Smith. Let's start with the scale of the surprise here. There really was no inkling that she was going to announce this.
Now, let's be honest, we were all completely taken by surprise, in part because Mrs May has herself repeatedly said she is not going to call a snap election. Now, she has broken that promise. Let's be clear about that. The reason she's broken it is Brexit. She believes she needs a united, strong hand in the forthcoming negotiations. She clearly wants to pitch herself as the Brexit candidate in the Brexit election, chastising the opposition parties and the House of Lords for weakening her negotiating stance. But there's also hard-headed calculation here. She has looked at the poll numbers, some polls suggesting she has a 20-point lead over Jeremy Corbyn. She would have to be the Mother Teresa of modern politics not to be tempted to go for an election in those circumstances, which would give her, if that was translated into seats, a huge majority, enable her to pursue her own agenda at Westminster, not be vulnerable because of possible revolts by Tory MPs. She may well have calculated that now is as good as it's going to get.
But how much of a gamble could it prove to be? Because as we've certainly seen over the last couple of years, in politics, nothing is certain, nothing is predictable.
I mean, the only truth about politics now is we live in extraordinarily volatile, unpredictable, uncertain times. You think pretty much no one predicted David Cameron would win an outright election victory. No one really thought Jeremy Corbyn would become leader of the Labour Party. No one really thought the UK was going to vote for Brexit, and probably not many people thought Theresa May was going to be Prime Minister. All that has come to pass, and we know opinion polls, we all now absolutely question them. And yet one other thing we know is that Theresa May has confounded us as a political leader. When she became Prime Minister, we knew her as the rather cautious, careful, calculating Home Secretary. As Prime Minister, she has proved a gambler, extraordinarily bold, not just in dispatching all the Cameroons, not just in pressing ahead with Brexit, not just in going for grammar schools, but now in going for this general election. And yes, it is a risk, but Theresa May has shown herself to be a gambler.
Norman Smith, for now, thank you very much. Well, there will, as we said, be a Commons vote that takes place tomorrow on Theresa May's plans for the snap general election in June. So that makes it 7 weeks and 2 days, if MPs agree to it, until the general election is held. Alex Forsyth has been looking at what will happen next.
It was almost 2 years ago when the country last had its say on the kind of government it wants.
Have a nice day.
Then, David Cameron at the helm, campaigning on the economy, the NHS, and with a promise to hold a referendum on EU membership. That was a decision that led to his resignation when the country backed Brexit.
I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction.
So Theresa May took over and pledged from the start to honour the referendum result.
Brexit means Brexit, and we're going to make a success of it.
Despite her slim majority in the Commons, she repeatedly said there would not be an early election.
I'm not going to be calling a snap election. I've been very clear that I think we need that period of time, that stability, to be able to deal with the issues that the country is facing and have that election in 2020.
But with such a slim majority in the House of Commons, parliamentary battles over Brexit beckoned. Theresa May wants a mandate, but will have to overcome a rule that says elections can only be held every 5 years. To get round the Fixed-Term Parliament Act, Theresa May will need the backing of 2/3 of MPs for an election, or there must be a vote of no confidence in the government. The Act could be repealed, or a new law enacted. Tomorrow, Theresa May will put a motion before Parliament seeking a general election on June the 8th. She'll almost certainly get the backing she needs. She hopes to increase support for her Brexit plan from across the country and among MPs. But general elections are always a risk.
Although the Labour Party are in a dire position in the opinion polls, a lot of the seats that they have are safe ones. And the truth is, therefore, if actually the opinion polls were to narrow during the course of this campaign, and I think we should bear in mind in particular, Theresa May is very much now going for a vote Conservative for my vision of Brexit, and that perhaps is going to make some Conservative voters unhappy. If that lead were to narrow, then we could discover that she's back with a rather smaller majority than perhaps she is hoping for this morning.
So once again, who holds control here and with how much clout will be for the country to decide. Alex Forsyth, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, we'll get more reaction now in a moment. We'll be speaking to our correspondents in Belfast and in Cardiff. Let's go first, though, to Lorna Gordon, who is in Edinburgh. And Lorna, we've already heard from Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, who has called it one of the most extraordinary U-turns in recent political history.
Yes, she has. Nicola Sturgeon was chairing her weekly cabinet meeting this morning at Bute House, which you see behind me. That took place before Theresa May made her statement, but we are told Nicola Sturgeon was watching as she announced her decision to call a snap general election. She said that this was a huge political miscalculation on the part of Theresa May, and it showed that Theresa May was putting the interests of her party ahead of those of her country. You can already see how the debate is going to be framed here in Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP saying that this will be a chance to reject the narrow, divisive policies, as they see it, of the Conservatives. Of course, the SNP won 56 out of 59 seats at the last general election. That was a result that they will be hoping to repeat this time around, but of course all the parties will now be scrabbling to find candidates quickly, with an election just a short distance ahead in the future. We've also had some reaction from the Scottish Conservatives, the second party here in Scotland. They say they are organised, optimistic, and they say that this will send a strong message if you vote for the Conservatives here in Scotland, that they would oppose the plans for a second independence referendum. So about Brexit, yes, but here in Scotland also about a second independence referendum.
And Chris Page in Belfast, the reaction there?
Sophie, parties in Northern Ireland are now going into their fourth election campaign in a little over 2 years. It's less than 2 months since there was a snap election to the Northern Ireland Assembly, which was brought about by the collapse of the devolved government in January. And that poll did produce a big political shift. For the first time, Unionists lost their overall majority of seats in the Stormont Chamber, and Sinn Féin came within a whisker of toppling the Democratic Unionist Party as the largest group at Stormont. That result and the ongoing debate over Brexit has led to more talk as to whether a united Ireland might be possible one day. So what all that means, I think, is that this general election will be about, perhaps more than ever before, unionism versus nationalism. In the last Westminster election in 2015, the two main unionist parties formed a pact to avoid splitting the unionist vote, and that secured 2 seats, which otherwise would probably have gone to non-unionist candidates. The bigger political question here in Northern Ireland has been whether devolved government can be restored. Negotiations have been ongoing, but there's been no sign of a deal, and the prospect of another divisive election is unlikely to encourage the parties to compromise.
And in Cardiff, Kemlyn Davis, what does it mean in Wales?
Yes, here in Wales, the Welsh First Minister, Labour's Carwyn Jones, has criticised Theresa May's decision, calling it odd. He thinks it's strange for the Prime Minister to call a general election while there's already another series of elections ongoing, referring to the council elections taking place across Wales in a little over a fortnight's time. Carwyn Jones doesn't believe a general election is in the national interest, and the focus should be on Brexit and the economy instead, he says. Plaid Cymru leader Leanne Wood says her party is ready for this opportunity, ready to show it can stand up for the people of Wales. And the leader of the Welsh Conservatives, Andrew R.T. Davies, as you'd expect, has welcomed the Prime Minister's decision. As for what this could mean for Wales, well, Labour currently holds 25 of the 40 Welsh parliamentary seats, but the party faces difficulties here, as it does across the UK, and the other parties, particularly Plaid Cymru and the Liberal Democrats, will be looking to capitalise on those difficulties. The Conservatives had their best Welsh general election results in 30 years, 2 years ago, but it's difficult to see where they'll make significant gains. Perhaps we'll get some more clues in 2 weeks' time, and those council elections on the 4th of May have taken on much greater political significance.
Lorna Gordon in Edinburgh, Chris Page in Belfast, and Kemlyn Davis in Cardiff. Thank you all for now. Well, when it was announced this morning that Theresa May was going to come out here in Downing Street and make a statement, no one knew what she was going to say. The market certainly felt a little nervous. Our business editor Simon Jack is in the newsroom for us now. Tell us what's been happening this morning.
Well, Sophie, markets don't generally like surprises, and this was certainly one of those. But I think they've stabilised now. And in fact, the pound is actually a little stronger. And I think that people realise there is an economic window of opportunity here. The dire warnings about what would happen to the economy post-Brexit referendum never came to pass. Growth is pretty solid. You've got record number of people in work. And crucially, wages are rising just a little bit faster than prices. Now, that is expected to go the other way later in the year. So that's why this timing makes sense. Now, businesses generally would prefer a government with a bigger majority to a smaller one. So if that pans out, then that will be better for them. But businesses also would prefer their Brexit served soft, and their focus will now move to the kind of language we see on things like immigration, single market, tariffs, etc., that she uses in the run-up to the election on June the 8th. So they will be focusing now on what kind of Brexit she will be gunning for. That will be the focus there.
Our business editor Simon Jack, thank you very much. So what will they make of it in Brussels, across the rest of the European Union? Kevin Connolly is in Brussels for us now. And what has the response been there, Kevin?
Well, of course, they are as surprised in Brussels as everyone in London was by this snap announcement.
You get a sense of that, I think, from the statement from the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, who said Brexit is being directed by Hitchcock. First of all, there's an earthquake, and then the tension rises. Now, of course, one of the things that means perhaps is that Donald Tusk doesn't know an enormous amount about the works of Alfred Hitchcock, but it also means that there's a real sense in Brussels that when the dust has settled from the British election, things will be a little different and the temperature will have increased. And that's because whoever wins in the British election, it's assumed here that they will have had to have given away something of their negotiating position in the whole process of the election. So for that reason, things will be watched very, very closely here in Brussels. And whatever the result, the message here is they are ready to talk to whoever wins.
Kevin Connolly in Brussels, thank you very much. Well, we'll be back to our main story shortly, but first some of the other day's main news for you. And the US Vice President Mike Pence is meeting the Japanese Prime Minister amid rising tensions over the security threat from North Korea. Mr. Pence reaffirmed Washington's commitment to reining in Pyongyang's nuclear ambitions, as Rupert Wingfield-Hayes reports.
North Korea's on a permanent war footing. The Kim dynasty that's led this isolated country for 3 generations has long relied on exaggerating external threats to maintain power. But in recent days it's revealed new weapons, underlining its own threat to the outside world. It's a threat which the Trump administration seems to be facing with new resolve. The US Vice President in Japan today, as part of his Asian tour, is emphasising a single message. The era of strategic patience with North Korea is over, and the US is standing firm with its regional allies.
As the President himself would say if he was here, let me be clear. To you, Mr. Prime Minister, and to all the people of Japan, we are with you 100%.
The focus is on a peaceful resolution to the North Korean threat, but Japan says words alone may not be enough.
Of course, we should seek a peaceful settlement of the issue, although I think dialogue for the sake of dialogue is meaningless. It is necessary for us to exercise pressure against North Korea to engage in serious dialogue.
North Korea's usual response to pressure is defiance. It says it may carry out weekly missile tests and would respond to an attack with nuclear weapons. President Trump wants China to force a change of direction in Pyongyang. He said if Beijing doesn't act, he will. But sanctions haven't worked and his military options are limited.
We now have a situation where both North Korea and the United States have threatened dire repercussions if the other ever makes a move. Now, in this kind of situation, it's possible to make mistakes and they can be catastrophic. But equally, this is the kind of balance of terror that held the world at peace for the Cold War.
North Korea is thought to be ready to conduct a 6th nuclear test, something which could happen at any time. And the USS Carl Vinson carrier group is steaming towards the Korean peninsula. Both sides then readying a show of force. The question is, which side will blink first? Richard Lister, BBC News.
The Duke of Cambridge has said it is important for people to talk openly about their mental health, and he's warned that no one should try to keep a stiff upper lip. His comments come after his brother, Prince Harry, disclosed that he'd had counselling to help him come to terms with their mother's death. Here's our royal correspondent, Peter Hunt.
Promoting better mental health is a family affair. After Prince Harry's frank acknowledgement of the pain he suffered following their mother's death, Prince William was at the BBC for a screening of a documentary on the subject.
10 people affected by mental health issues, united by one goal, to run the London Marathon.
Are you convinced it can help?
Most definitely.
I just feel like I'm not going to be able to do it.
Joined by some special guests.
You're the heroes.
Kate, William and Harry want mental health treated like physical health.
I really think this is a pivotal moment in the change in mental health. I really feel we're on the cusp of something really big, and I know the BBC are keen to continue covering mental health and really trying to make that change. As you can see, I have my own reasons for being involved in mental health. What happened to me, my mother when I was younger.
One of the marathon runners who met William is Rhianne. Her 1-year-old son died 5 years ago. Her husband, who blamed himself, took his own life 5 days afterwards. Her story features in the programme presented by Nick Knowles.
And the more people we can get to talk about mental health, the better, because the silence is killing people. It really is. It's as bad as that. And I think, yeah, I should stop talking now. Otherwise I sound like Nick Knowles.
Meeting the runners, confronting their adversity and watching the programme left William, he said, feeling quite emotional. Their next challenge is the race in 6 days' time. Peter Hunt, BBC News.
Let's go back to our main story this lunchtime now, and the surprise announcement just a short time ago that the Prime Minister plans to call a snap general election on Thursday, June the 8th. That's in just over 7 weeks' time. She said, as she stood out here, that Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the Scottish National Party and some members of the House of Lords, she accused them of weakening her negotiating position in talks with the European Union over Brexit. Well, our correspondent Christian Fraser has been looking at how people have been voting in the most recent elections.
OK, let's take a look at general election 2015 to remind ourselves. This was the map. The Conservatives took 331 seats. That was a majority of 12, 99 more seats than Labour, who were practically wiped off the map in Scotland. This little red spot here is the only seat they held, Edinburgh South. It was a very difficult election too for the Liberal Democrats, who were wiped out in the southwest of the country. They returned with just 8 seats. Let's compare that then to the referendum in 2016, and you can see the map looks broadly the same. The Conservative areas voting broadly in favour of Brexit. But look, North Wales, the North West, the North East, Labour heartland going for Brexit. And that is going to be the challenge for Jeremy Corbyn on the doorstep. Yes, the leadership is in favour of Brexit, but not all the MPs, and they are deeply divided over the terms of Brexit that they want. Let's have a look then at the by-elections for some clues. This one is a bright spot for Liberal Democrats because they overturned a whopping 23,000 majority that Zach Goldsmith was holding. He stood as an independent and Sarah Olney took it from him. Richmond Park, a very pro-Remain area. This is a very big Brexit area, Stoke-on-Trent Central, but it was a Labour hold, so they can hold Brexit areas. They saw off a very strong challenge from the UKIP leader Paul Nuttall. But the dark spot for them, of course, was Copeland. This was the first time a sitting government had won a by-election since 1984, and Labour had represented that seat for over 80 years. A big pro-Brexit area, 62% went for Brexit. So there are some things that all the parties are going to have to bear in mind, and they're going to look at that Brexit map for clues. But there are other things they'll have to think about. Voter fatigue. We've had 3 UK-wide elections in 3 years. There have been elections in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, 3 in Northern Ireland in little over a year. And then they're going to have to think about how the population splits down, because there are very differing views among different age groups. So young people, you can see in blue, went for Remain, and older people in red went for Leave. How are these groups of people going to vote in a new general election? We just don't know, but there might be some clues in that for all the parties.
And after all...
Well, what are people going to make about the fact that there is now going to be another general election in just a few weeks' time? Our correspondent John Kay is in the Bristol West constituency, a Labour seat that was taken from the Lib Dems in 2015. John.
Yeah, Sophie, it's an interesting seat, this, because historically Bristol West was a Conservative seat. Then it went Lib Dem. Last election went Labour, but with the Greens in second place. So we thought it was an interesting place to come to today and just find out how people are thinking, because this is a diverse constituency and people here tend to be quite politically active, quite politically engaged, interested in the whole process. So we took some of them by surprise and asked them what they thought, starting with Brenda.
You're joking. Not another one? Oh, for God's sake, I can't stand this. There's too much politics going on at the moment. Why does she need to do it?
She says this will produce clarity, it gets things out in the open, sorts things out.
I thought she said that initially when she took over. No, I disagree with this entirely. I'm sorry.
Are you excited about another election?
No, no, not another one. It's too much, isn't it?
It's great news.
Good?
Well, yeah, because it means that we can get her out.
Let's see what the people want. So,
do you feel ready for a general election?
Yeah, we need one.
So Christian was talking a moment ago about potential voter fatigue. That's just a snapshot of people here. A lot of them taken by surprise. Not just voters taken by surprise. Bumped into some party workers here a short time ago who were out canvassing ahead of local elections and the Metro Mayor election for the West of England. All of a sudden they're having to think about how a general election fits into their campaigning strategy. Leaflets to produce, posters to go up, in some cases candidates to select. If the Prime Minister wanted to cause a surprise and a stir by this, at least she's definitely succeeded on that front. Sophie.
John Kay, thank you. Well, I'm joined again by our assistant political editor, Norman Smith. This is going to be the Brexit election, isn't it?
It is, because Mrs May wants to pitch it as such. She wants to pitch herself as the Brexit candidate, standing up for the Brexit electorate against the sort of dissenters and doubters at Westminster. She's almost pitching herself slightly as the sort of anti-Westminster candidate, standing up for the true voice of Brexit. It's also going to be extraordinarily difficult, I think, for Labour to turn this into an election about the NHS or social care or anti-austerity. And in some ways, it seems to me there are analogies with Mrs Thatcher's 1983 Falklands election, when again Labour had a leader who was struggling, and again they found it very difficult to move away from that huge Falklands factor. And I suspect it may be similar this time. That said, Brexit remains an incredibly divisive issue. And the risk for Mrs May is that there are still many, many people passionately opposed to Brexit. We saw that in the Richmond by-election when the Conservative MP Zac Goldsmith sought to get re-elected and was defeated because the Lib Dems campaigned on Brexit. There will be many Tory MPs in Remain constituencies who will be deeply anxious that Mrs May has underestimated that residual determination of Remain voters. So yes, it'll be the Brexit election, but it is also a huge risk for Mrs May in case she is miscalculated about the strength of feeling, not just on the Brexit side, but also on the Remain side.
Norman Smith, thank you. Let's have a look at the latest weather now with Louise Lear.
Thanks, Sophie. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, I'm sure gardeners and growers not particularly happy that I'm starting with a picture of frost, but it's going to be one of the talking points this week. Just take a look at the overnight lows that we had this morning, -6 in Scotland, and temperatures generally across the nation just below freezing. But at this time of year, add some sunshine into the mix, temperatures do recover. But where we've got the clear skies by day and highs of around 13 degrees, we're going to see those temperatures falling away overnight. So Tuesday night across England and Wales is going to be another cold, potentially frosty one. Put in another way, take a look at yesterday's satellite picture. More cloud across England and Wales, but clear skies through Scotland and Northern Ireland. So it's the cloud cover that's the issue, really. Today we've got more cloud in the northwest, and with those clear skies across England and Wales, that's where it's going to fall quite chilly. But let's enjoy the sunshine while we can. For the rest of the afternoon, it will be really quite pleasant out there. 11 to 13 degrees with a light breeze, perhaps a nagging breeze off the North Sea, making it feel just a little chillier with a few isolated showers, but a good slice of sunshine even up into eastern Scotland as well. Clouding over through Northern Ireland and into northwest Scotland, there'll be a weak weather front, and that's going to produce some outbreaks of rain by the end of the afternoon. But that blanket of cloud will continue to drift its way across Scotland and Northern Ireland through the night. Elsewhere, we keep the clear skies. It'll be quite a quiet night to come, but the temperatures are really expected to fall away quite sharply. Not so maybe in towns and city centres, but in rural spots, we're likely to see lows across England and Wales of -3 to -4 degrees. So your tender spring plants and blossom not going to be pretty happy with that, I'm afraid. There will at least be some lovely spells of sunshine again across much of England and Wales, clouding over a little through North Wales and Northern England with that weak weather front, the odd spit and spot of rain. But North East Scotland brightening up and just warming up a little bit here. 11 to 15 degrees the overall high on Wednesday. It is a quiet theme of weather, but we start off on Thursday where we have the clear skies with a chilly start, some sunshine coming through, a good deal of dry weather yet again in the story, just some showery outbreaks of rain into the far north and west. And these weak weather fronts trying to squeeze their way down through the North Sea, not really having too much of an impact. The high pressure hanging on in there out in the Atlantic, which basically means we continue with this dry theme over the next few days. Some sunny spells and perhaps some warmth into the London area. With those weak weather fronts, we always keep a little more in the way of cloud and drizzle. Back to Sophie in Downing Street.
Louise, thank you very much. Well, the main story this lunchtime, the Prime Minister has called for a snap general election to be held on Thursday, June the 8th. She said that she had recently and reluctantly come to the decision that a vote was needed to see the UK through Brexit and beyond.
At this moment of enormous national significance, there should be unity here in Westminster. But instead, there is division. The country is coming together, but Westminster is not.
There will, of course, be plenty more coverage of this story throughout the afternoon on BBC News. But from me here in Downing Street, it's goodbye. Time now for the news where you are.
You're watching BBC News with me, Simon McCoy, here in Westminster on what history will judge as a pretty momentous day, the calling of a snap general election by the Prime Minister Theresa May, scheduled for 11:15 this morning, that statement. She actually came out a bit early because it was beginning to leak. Let's talk about reaction to it, because Angus Robertson, leader of the SNP in the Parliament, is with me. And you got up this morning at home, snowing. This was the last thing you expected, isn't it?
Yeah, I was scraping the snow off the car windscreen, and the fact that there might be a UK general election wasn't going through my mind in those cold temperatures, and it still wasn't on my mind when I got on the plane to fly down from Aberdeen. But as soon as I landed, it became apparent that there was going to be a general election. So it's a surprise to most people, and it's obviously a massive U-turn by the Prime Minister, who said that now's not the time for elections or referenda, because she wanted to apparently concentrate on negotiating Brexit. Well, now we are going to have a general election. We're Democrats, so we're up for the fight. And do I think when it's a straight two-horse race in Scotland that people will vote SNP or they'll vote Tory? I think people vote SNP.
You have all but 3 seats. I mean, this is for you to lose seats, isn't it? And if you do lose any seats...
Look, with the greatest humility, no Democratic politician should go into any election taking any vote for granted or any seat for granted. But it is true to say that the SNP holds almost every single seat in the country, but we don't hold all of them. So is there room for improvement? Yes, there is. And we will fight to win in every single seat in Scotland, because there are great stakes at play in this election. Because, of course, the reason why the Prime Minister is holding an election has nothing to do with Scotland. It's everything to do with English politics and the weakness of the Labour Party.
She would say it's about Brexit. She says this is about Brexit and having the strength to negotiate from a position of unity in Westminster. She said there is none at the moment.
She's not going to have unity at Westminster, because, with the greatest respect, people in Scotland are not going to vote Tory. And so it is going to remain a disunited kingdom. We voted by 62% to remain in the European Union. We're fighting to protect a place for ourselves in Europe and resisting Tory austerity and all the rest of it. So there is not going to be unity at Westminster, and who wants a one-party state in a parliament anyway? We are sent here because we have
that's what you have in Scotland, isn't it?
No, we have proportional representation, and all political parties are represented in Parliament according to their strength. But where you are correct in suggesting, and the SNP is very popular in Scotland, and that's why we have many members of the Scottish Parliament, and that's why we have many members of Parliament here at Westminster. And when voters in Scotland are confronted in a context of the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats being electorally finished, that it is a straight choice between a moderate mainstream SNP that wants to protect our position in Europe, that is opposed to the austerity agenda, that's not anti-immigrant, that doesn't support a rape clause, an ever more extreme Tory party. I think when the choice is between those two things, I think people in Scotland will vote SNP. And I should say, incidentally, thank you for all the kind messages I've been receiving today asking whether the SNP will stand in the rest of the UK, but I have to disappoint and say we have no plans to stand in the rest of the UK yet.
Well, have you spoken to Nicola Sturgeon since this announcement?
Yes.
I'm just wondering if you both went, oh, she shot our fox. We're going to get a UK election before we've got a second referendum.
No, not at all. I mean, the first thing to say in relation to the referendum, of course, is that the Scottish Government has a mandate to hold that referendum, and the Scottish Parliament's already voted for that referendum to take place. So that has already happened. But what this election will be about is whether people in the UK as a whole, and Scotland specifically from our point of view, are prepared to give the Tory party a blank cheque to pursue a hard Brexit. And we didn't vote for that. Even people who voted Leave in Scotland didn't vote for the kind of hard Brexit that we're heading towards. It's going to be massively damaging, and I don't think that's what people want. So given that, and people will have a choice, I think in Scotland people would much prefer to vote for the SNP than vote for a hard Brexit Tory party.
What does this mean for Labour in England, do you think?
I think it's really bad news for the Labour Party in England. You look at their polling numbers, they're the worst since 1983. Apparently the Labour MPs are in despair, expecting to lose their seats. What you're actually seeing is a massive realignment in English politics and then by extension UK politics, where the centre weight of political gravity is moving to the further to the right and not in a good direction. And unfortunately, I mean, I fear for people in England who don't have a viable political alternative that can beat the Tories. Thank goodness we do in Scotland, and that's why I think the SNP will do well.
Angus Robertson, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us.
us.
So it's going to be pretty hectic all day here at Westminster. You start one conversation, another MP walks along. Nigel Evans is here from the Conservatives. Thank you, Angus.
Simon, how are
you? I'm very well. I'm just wondering, why did she change her mind?
Well, like every MP who got out of bed this morning, the last thing I thought I'd be doing today is actually talking to you, Simon, about the general election on June the 8th. And I think she's reflected on the opportunities that this early general election gives. So, number one, she took over from David Cameron without an endorsement at a general election. Yes, technically she doesn't need that, but it gives her the opportunity now to set out her stall for the next 5 years, Brexit being part of that, but there'll be other things that she will want to demonstrate to the British public. So they're voting for a Prime Minister who's going to be leading this country for 5 years, not just for a couple of years, and that's important.
What do you say to those who look, hang on, this is a very cynical attempt. She's seen the state of the Labour Party as she sees it and thinks this is the best time to do it.
Well, I think she'd be bonkers to call an early general election if she thought she was going to lose it. So she's clearly looked at the majority that she could easily get if the margins between her and the Labour Party remain as they are. It's 20-odd points ahead in the polls. That's good. This early opportunity for an election gives her then the chance to have a stronger majority at Westminster, so that when she negotiates the Brexit that she wants to with Tusk and Juncker, she'll have a much stronger hand. So I actually think it's a win-win.
Is there a risk that for the Prime Minister, this hands the Liberal Democrats their opportunity to say, right, we're going to rerun the Brexit debate now?
I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. Most polls say that irrespective of whether people voted Remain or not, now the British public have decided by a margin of well over 1 million to leave the European Union, they accept it. Tim Farron's never accepted that. This is a man who didn't want one referendum. Now all of a sudden he wants a couple of referendums. It would actually diminish the strength of the Prime Minister in negotiating with Europe if they thought at the end of it it would have to be endorsed yet again by yet another referendum. The fact is the British public have voted to leave the European Union. It was quite clear on that document that got sent to everybody's letterboxes that the British government would accept the views of the British public. That's what we've got to do. Tim Farron won't do that. You know, Tim Farron has not accepted the fact that we want to leave the European Union. So much does he love the EU, he can't accept the view of the British public.
What's a good result for the Tories in a general election at this stage? What would make this worthwhile?
Oh, I think a majority clearly bigger than what it currently is. I've been fighting elections since 1987. This will be my 10th parliamentary election. You build up a wisdom, Simon, not to predict. All I can say is that when I sit in the chamber of the House of Commons and I look at Jeremy Corbyn perform, and then I look at the people sitting behind him, his MPs, they've got no faith in Corbyn as leader of their party. They've tried to get rid of him twice. Now, if his own MPs haven't got faith in their leader, why should the British public? And that gives me confidence that when the British public sit down on June the 8th and say, right, who do I want to see walking through the door of number 10? Is it going to be Corbyn as Prime Minister or Theresa May? I think it's going to be Theresa May.
Nigel Evans, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Plenty more to come from Westminster, but now over to Robert Hall. Robert.
Yes, Simon, Theresa May's decision today is hardly likely to put her at any great political risk here in her constituency of Royal Windsor and Maidenhead. Her majority at the last election was just over 29,000, and if you look at the stats, then her share of the vote and her majority have been rising steadily since 2005. She's been MP since 1997. People here have been watching her political career with great interest. This is a woman born a daughter of a clergyman, raised in Oxfordshire, had early political ambitions to lead her country. I think at the time she talked about being the first woman leader. She was pipped to the post, of course, by Mrs. Thatcher. People watched very closely her time as Home Secretary, the second longest serving Home Secretary in 100 years. And now, as Prime Minister, she comes out into Downing Street and makes what could be another significant announcement, another very momentous political decision. So we went and spoke to some of the shoppers here in Maidenhead and asked them what they made of it this morning.
What do I think? It's a bit soon, isn't it? She's only just got in, hasn't she? I don't know what to make of it.
I just heard it on the news. I was absolutely staggered. I can't, like she's called one, I can't really see the reason why. I mean, I know there's a lot going on and there's the question about Brexit, but yeah, I was really quite astounded.
I think it's a good thing, really. I do. I think after the Brexit type thing, and she went straight into power, I think the people didn't have a chance to have their say. I think maybe it should have been a little bit earlier, but now it seems to be good. No time like the present, I say.
A general election, they'll get in again, unfortunately, because Labour, who really do fight for the poor, are not... Jeremy Corbyn's a great guy, and I think he's wonderful, but he's just not strong enough. I wish he was.
Well, you heard the word Brexit in some of those vox pops there. Well, 53.9% in this constituency voted to remain. Now, of course, Theresa May famously spoken of as a reluctant leaver. We shall see whether Brexit is spoken of here, amongst other issues. She has said throughout her period as Home Secretary and now Prime Minister that she wants to remain accessible to the constituency. She's still out there doing regular canvassing and door-to-door visits. In fact, last week she was even pictured helping to organise a local charity event. So she is very much available to constituents. They will have a lot they want to ask her, whatever the subjects might be in the coming weeks, Simon.
Robert, thank you very much. So, 4 or 5 hours ago, this place was empty, College Green. Everybody thinking this was just going to be a run-of-the-mill day in the world of politics. That's all changed with that announcement just after 11 o'clock. Theresa May saying she wants to call a snap election on June the 8th. It goes to Parliament tomorrow for a vote. Labour has said they will not oppose it. So everybody now gearing up for a general election June the 8th. Anita.
Simon, thank you very much. It certainly has changed today, hasn't it? And the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has welcomed Mrs May's announcement, saying his party would offer an effective alternative to the Conservatives and give the people of Britain the chance to vote for a government that put the interests of the majority first.
I welcome the opportunity for us to put the case to the people of Britain, to stand up against this government and its failed economic agenda, which has left our NHS in problems, which has left our schools underfunded, which has left so many people uncertain. We want to put a case out there for the people of Britain of a society that cares for all, an economy that works for all, and a Brexit that works for all.
Labour's been consistently behind in opinion polls, so you're not particularly in a strong starting place. Would you concede that? Would you concede that you face an uphill struggle from here?
We're going out there to put the case of how this country could be run, how it could be different, how we could have a much fairer society that works for all, for everybody in our community. That's the case we're putting, and I'm looking forward to doing it.
So what will you be doing then over the coming weeks to turn around the polls and secure a Labour victory?
We're putting the case out there to deal with the housing crisis, to deal with the education funding crisis, to deal with the National Health Service, but above all, about an economy that works for all by investment in our infrastructure, investment in our manufacturing industries, to give real hope and real opportunities for everybody in this country.
Labour lost the general election just 2 years ago. What's different about your offering to the country this time round?
We're challenging the economic narrative which says that there has to be huge cuts in public expenditure in order to pay for the banking crisis of 2008. We're saying instead, invest in the economy, invest in the future. We are a party that will put forward a case that will bring about a much fairer, much more decent country than we're getting at the present time, where we have massive inequalities between the very rich minority and, sadly, too many people living in desperate poverty at the other end of the scale.
The 8th of June, does that give you enough time to get that message out there?
I'm starting straight away and I'm looking forward to it. We will take our message to every single part of this country and we'll challenge the government to debate these issues in every town and city in this country.
If Labour loses this election, will you stand down as Labour?
We are campaigning to win this election. That's the only question now.
Are you the next Prime Minister?
If we win the election, yes, and I want to lead a government that will transform this country, give real hope to everybody, and above all, bring about a principle of justice for everybody and economic.
Jeremy Corbyn. Well, let's speak now to Kevin Maguire, Associate Editor of the Daily Mirror. He's in our central London studio. Kevin, hello to you. Well, as if the political landscape in the UK wasn't already complicated enough, now we have another general election. Theresa May says it's the only way to bring about certainty and stability to get through the Brexit process. But what guarantee does she actually have that that is going to be the effect?
None, actually, and certainly in Scotland, where there's the SNP have been pushing for a second referendum, she'll probably lose a position there. No, she's gambled, and she gambles because she knows Brexit will be a nightmare. She knows living standards are about to be squeezed because inflation's going up faster than wages, and she wants to capitalise on Labour's woes, Labour's weaknesses. The party is badly split, and it is a purely party advantage reason she's gone for it. It's nakedly political. We know that. You can see that. And I, like many people, made the mistake of believing the Prime Minister in the past when she said she wouldn't go for a general election. She would now have us believe she went to Snowdonia, was walking in the mountains up there, and then suddenly changed her mind. It doesn't quite ring true.
OK, well, what is this going to mean, this election for Labour? Jeremy Corbyn, as we just heard in that interview, wouldn't be drawn on the gap in the polls between Labour and the Conservatives.
No, he won't be drawn because it's a terrible gap, and Labour's way behind. Which poll you look at, well, it's 15 to 20%. Labour's never gone into a general election in such a bad position since 1983, and arguably worse than that when they were absolutely hammered. And she expects to hammer them, and Jeremy Corbyn has an absolute mountain to climb. And most of the Labour MPs will be fighting their seats. Not so very long ago, voted no confidence in him. The party is badly split. It's getting poor results in local elections. It lost that Cumbrian by-election up in Copeland. So Labour is very weak, and somehow he's going to have to outperform himself. He's going to have to do better than he has done so far. He's going to have to unite his party. And Labour regularly boasts it's the biggest political party in Western Europe. Well, he's going to have to mobilise all those members, get them knocking on doors, and hopefully convince sceptical voters that those policies he has, which are individually popular, means he should have a shot at Downing Street, because he is a leader who trails his party, which is doing badly anyway. And while the policies may be popular, Labour is really struggling.
Perversely, though, Kevin, and briefly, if you would, of course, there will be Labour MPs wanting to hold on to their seats, but wanting to see Jeremy Corbyn out as a result of this. They will see this as an opportunity for some necessary bloodletting, in their opinion.
No, one Labour source described to me as a silver lining, that if Labour lose, then Jeremy Corbyn will go as leader. There's actually no guarantee of that, as there is no guarantee of anything now in British politics. But you're quite right. Other people in Labour have admitted that trying to be cheerful all the way to 8th of June, when they're expecting to get a real kicking, is going to be very, very difficult. But Jeremy Corbyn knows he's up against it. It's just whether he can actually rise to the occasion, pull his party together, and convince sceptical Labour voters that he has something. He's going to have to play the anti-Tory card very, very strongly. But at the moment, Theresa May, she's called the election because she expects to win. May not, but the odds are she will.
OK, Kevin, thank you for your thoughts on the developments so far today, Kevin Maguire. And right now, let's go back to Simon at College Green. Simon.
Anita, thank you very much. So everybody now on election footing. Let's talk to two gentlemen, one from UKIP, Peter Whittle, and Jonathan Bartley from the Green Party. Caught you by surprise?
Yes, it's caught us by surprise, but at the same time, now that it's been announced, it's actually quite exciting. I mean, we've got 6 weeks, we've got people in place, we've got the organisation, we've got the funding, we're going to be off and going. And
so you have people in place. How many people and in how many places?
Well, no, we hope to have the same amount as we fought in 2015. Obviously, 2 years, it's been, we haven't been sitting with our, on our hands. We've been getting organisation.
Well, no, you've lost the only MP you've had.
Yeah, but at the same time, we've been targeting various different parts of the country where we stand a very, very good chance. And I think that's what we're going to be doing different this time.
And those target seats are where for you?
Well, certain seats in the north, then also down in the east of England, and then in the southeast.
OK, Jonathan, for the Greens, Is this an opportunity? What does today's decision mean?
This is a great opportunity. We're ready. We're really looking forward to it. We've got seats like Bristol West, where Molly Scott-Cato, our MEP, is standing. We want to make a gain there. We want to make a gain in Sheffield, where our former leader Natalie Bennett is standing. And if people want a party that's going to oppose extreme Brexit, is going to fight very, very hard to maintain those environmental protections that are threatened, but also will challenge the austerity, the cuts that this government's been pushing through, there's only one place to go. It's the Green Party.
You say fight extreme Brexit. Is it to fight Brexit, to re-fight that battle?
No, it's to fight the extreme Brexit. UKIP said, to the government, jump, and the government said, how high? They've hijacked it. We are the antidote to UKIP. We are everything that UKIP is not. We believe in building bridges, being outward-looking, not building walls. And we want a very hopeful future. We feel like this is a moment where we're facing a fork in the road. We can go one of two directions. We can be an outward-looking, inclusive country that really reaches out, that says we are better than this, or we can retreat into the narrow-minded version of Britain that UKIP wants.
No, the fact of the matter is that, Johnson's not being completely honest here. The Greens believe in open borders, right? They don't believe in borders at all, right? But they never actually say that. You never say that, but that is the truth. That,
would you like me to say something
people,
now?
no, hang on. People actually voted very, very clearly, right, for control of our borders, control of our trade deals, and our own sovereignty. You talk about extreme Brexit, hard Brexit, soft Brexit. Most people think that is a load of rubbish. They know exactly what they voted for, right? And those are the things I just said. But you should tell people that you actually believe in open borders.
Let me tell you what I absolutely believe, and that's this country has been sold a lie. We've been told that migrants are to blame for everything, for the cuts in our public services, for the strain on our hospitals. It's not true. You know what? When I was a kid, we were told there were going to be. Let me just finish the question. When I was a kid, I was told we're going to have this massive wealth creation with huge technological advance. We'll all be able to work fewer hours. We'll be wealthier. You know what? We've had all that wealth creation. We've had that technological advance, but we haven't seen that. And we're saying we can redistribute wealth. We can be better than this. We can be hopeful. And yes, I'm absolutely unapologetic in backing freedom of movement. I believe it's a wonderful thing that my children have enjoyed, and the rest of the country should enjoy.
Yeah, the truth is, it's not just about freedom of movement. They believe in totally open borders, right? Nobody in this country really believes in that. People voted Brexit to have control of our borders. What you're seeing now with the government is that they're not even talking about migration. They're talking about, in fact, the current levels going on for about another 10 years. We stand for proper control of our migration system with a points-based system.
Peter Whittle, thank you very much. John Bartley's our right of time. Thank you very much for that. I mean, we've got many weeks of this coming up. Let's get the business news. Over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Simon. Now, the news that the Prime Minister, Theresa May, would be making an announcement this morning gave the markets a wobble. Sterling took a bit of a tumble. However, once investors heard that the announcement was a general election, the pound recovered. And in fact, it's now at a 10-week high. However, the FTSE is down. It's down nearly 2% at the moment. However, it was down before any of this actually happened. Earlier this morning, a fall in commodity prices pulled down mining stocks. And then that bounce in sterling, well, that usually translates into a fall in the value of the FTSE, because so much of the index is made up of global companies who bank their profits in dollars or euros, so a stronger sterling reduces those values. But let's cut through all of that and find out what the markets make of this move by the British Prime Minister Theresa May. Joining us now live from the city is Callum Pickering. He's senior UK economist at Berenberg Bank. Callum, how would you describe the market's reaction?
So much to think about. The market is basing its most likely scenario that the Conservatives win, which means that in the sort of short to medium term, the status quo doesn't change and the economy continues as it has for the last few months. But in the long term, I think given that the most likely outcome is the Conservatives take even more control over Brexit, the risk of a hard Brexit has risen a little. So in a couple of weeks, months, we may see markets begin to price that in more acutely.
I think the risk of a hard Brexit could have risen, because I've read some other analysts suggesting that if Theresa May has a stronger mandate, then she could perhaps serve up a softer Brexit, because she won't need to have the support of so many of the hardline Brexiteers. And perhaps a softer Brexit could be served up, which businesses would prefer.
That is exactly the sort of uncertainty that make it difficult to price these sorts of things. The way I'm seeing it at the moment is that de facto, any vote for the Conservatives is a vote against any of the other parties, which would be for a soft Brexit. So I think that, judging Theresa May, ex-Home Office, not really a business background, I think she'd probably be willing to accept a little less economic growth for an improved social fabric in the UK, which means that if the voters judge Brexit as only being a success if it reduces migration, then that's the policy that she will go for. And we know from the EU stance that if the UK aims to reduce EU migration by introducing larger barriers, then that will mean that post-Brexit, the UK and the EU will not enjoy such preferential terms of trade, and that in the long run will damage economic growth, both from the lower migration and the impact on trade.
Now, Callum, very briefly, this is a fairly muted reaction from the markets. Very briefly, when do you expect to see a big reaction?
Only if there's an upset on 8th of June. If we have a hung parliament, I can't conceivably see that Labour or the Liberal Democrats would win. But if we have a hung parliament, I say give a 20% chance, then we will see markets really go crazy. Because what happens? The UK has already triggered Article 50, but it does not have an agreement within Westminster on what sort of Brexit it should happen. So on the one hand, you have this risk that the UK, after 2 years with no agreement in Parliament, leaves the EU without a Brexit deal, or you have the other extreme scenario where, say, a coalition of pro-EU supporters actually soften Brexit terms a little. So, base case, the Conservatives win. I don't expect much in markets.
We're going to have to leave it there. Callum Pickering, Senior UK Economist at Berenberg Bank. That's it from us. We'll have much more throughout the next hour. Now it's time for the weather with Louise Lear.
Good afternoon. It may well have been a chilly start, but there's some lovely spring sunshine out there. Just take a look at this Weather Watchers picture in Leicestershire. But I could have showed you numerous shots today because we've got sunshine through eastern Scotland, the whole of England and Wales. A little more cloud into Northern Ireland this afternoon and eventually some rain pushing into the far northwest of Scotland. Here it's still on the chilly side with 8 or 9 degrees, but highest values of 14 in the southeast corner. Now, as we go through the night where we've had the clear skies by day, those temperatures are really going to drop off very quickly indeed. The exception will be Northern Ireland and Scotland. Here we keep more cloud and temperatures perhaps holding up a little, but elsewhere we're going to see lows down to -4 degrees. A widespread hard frost is possible in some places. Not great news for those young, tender spring plants out there. At least there will be plenty of sunshine again across England and Wales. A band of cloud into North Wales and Northern England eventually. Brighter for Scotland and not quite as cold. Take care.